The wind moved through the junipers with a low, steady voice, as if the land itself were speaking and no one had listened in far too long. Dust lifted and hung like breath in prayer. Somewhere, a raven cracked the quiet with a single black note, and was gone. She hung between air and earth, numb hands gone to ash, vision dimming and brightening in broken pulses. The rope pressed a cruel circle into the fine muscles of her neck, biting and whispering and stealing. The cabin's rafters were splintered and old. She saw that much in the wavering scraps of sight that came back like fish surfacing for one. Impossible moment. She could taste cedar sap and iron. There was an orange scarf, hers, caught on a nail in the window frame, flaring when a gust pushed through the boards. Somewhere below, the cracked mouth of a clay jar opened like a thirsty throat. Her mind clung to a single thought: breathe. The chair had gone over. She remembered the kick, the boot that knocked it, an edge of spurs, a hand she could not forgive, the smell of tobacco, spit and dust, and a shirt that had never seen soap. She remembered the hissed words, the lie made into a verdict. Horse thief. Another voice behind it. Message. Then the hiss of a match, a lantern being raised, men stepping back from their work to look at what they had made of her. Not boys, men with winter in their eyes. The cabin had been empty save for them, and for her. It was still empty, now that. They were gone. Breathe. But there was no air left to borrow. Her name, the one her mother spoke in quiet, was hidden deep like a root. To the townspeople she was Aria Quintero, because that name fit on papers, because it made ordnance men and store ledgers less suspicious. The other name, her first breath name, belonged to cedar smoke and mountain water, and the low laughter of aunties who would not live to see her grown. She did not let that name surface. Names needed breath, her vision tunneled. Heat washed through her, and then a cold like the inside of winter. A soft circle of light rolled toward the door. No, not a circle, an eye. Not a human eye, but a lantern's. Boots on the step. A pause. The door, patched with rawhide at the bottom, trembled inward. A man filled the doorway, broad shoulders against the sky, hat brim cutting his eyes to shadow. He did not speak immediately. The lantern's beam climbed the plank wall, the wooden pegs, the rafter. He saw her. The rope sang, wood against hemp when he moved. A knife flashed. The beam trembled, his breath came up hard, slammed down, came up again. He didn't talk to her. He talked to the rope. Hold, he said to it. Don't you let her go. His hat scraped the beam. The knife worked. The room dipped and came back. She felt the rope hesitate, then part. The world rushed up. Arms caught her under ribs and knees, and pain whitened the edges of sight again. Easy, easy. Stay here, he ordered the floorboards, as if that might persuade the earth not to tilt. She couldn't answer. The air her lungs found was a new shape she did not know how to hold. She coughed, a small sound, like a bird slamming a window, then falling. The coil of cut rope dropped near her cheek. He laid her on a wool coat that smelled of saddle and sun-hardened leather, folded it under her head with an awkward tenderness, and slid a canteen under her lips. Water found her mouth. It hurt. It also delivered a sliver of sky to the inside of her chest. Just a little, he murmured. The voice came low and cautious, as if he had learned what it did to startle the wounded. There you go. There. Breathe for me. Hands found her hair, pulled it gently away from the raw ring at her neck. She saw him properly only in pieces. A square jaw with a day's black dust on it, a deep line along one cheekbone like a healed cut, eyes more grey than blue, more stone than sky. A man of 30 maybe, not yet worn smooth by years, but edged enough by work to have corners that would not easily weather away. He glanced at the beam. Who did this? The question aimed at the room, not her. He was already moving again, knife out, cutting the rope free from the rafter, as if the sight of it might rise and strangle her again, given any invitation. Her throat stung when she tried to make sound. The cut in her voice felt like the knife had been there as well. "Water," she managed, the word almost not a word at all, just the shape of need. He steadied the canteen for her. Slow, the swallow found its way to where breath lived. A fresh pain shuddered through and then floating, not weightless, but unmoored. The cabin's walls stopped listing. The lantern found a nail and hung obediently. The wind outside spoke like an aunt telling a story around a fire. "Aria," she rasped, because she needed to set a border around herself. "My name," he nodded, like the name had already been guessed. "Aria," he said back, making the shape of it careful, as if names were breakable. "I'm Callum Thorne." Thorne. The word made a small glass sound in her head. She stored it and let it cool. A coyote called far off. She slid the back of her hand beneath the bruised line at her throat and felt the swollen cord of it, a thread, sewn into flesh. Memory bucked. Boots, a laugh that did not know what it was laughing at, and a hand with a scar across the knuckles. The scar's white line had dragged the skin like a snake through sand. "Don't try to speak," Callum said, catching the wince on her face. "More water, then we walk your breath back to you." He eased her up against the wall. The coat became a prop under her shoulder. The lantern filled the room with a color like tea. Patient, bitter, warm. She could see more of him now. The edge-worn shirt, the Clark-bought vest gone shiny at the seams, the boots repaired as if they were friends. He looked like men who did not make promises because they kept them. "How did you know to come?" she whispered. He glanced toward the door where daylight had thinned to a grey sheet. "I didn't." He lowered his eyes to the dirt floor, as if embarrassed by his own ignorance. "I bought this cabin at the county sale this morning. $7 and a warrant scribbled by a deputy who used a whiskey glass as a stamp. Figured I'd see what my money bought. Figured it'd be rats and rot. Didn't figure—" He didn't finish the sentence, measuring his breath instead. His mouth pressed into a shape that suggested shame without weight, the shame of walking into someone else's ruin and finding her still inside it. Aria closed her eyes and fought the rope that wasn't there anymore. She could still feel it. Bodies remember longer than minds. The neatness of the knot returned to her, the way it had been tied quick, like the man who tied it had tied such knots before. She could still hear the lantern glass chime when a man bumped it, the swift apology. That came after for the lantern, not for her. She could still feel the chair go light and the world go thin. The air came easier minute by minute. She drew it, counted it, held it. In the small stillness that followed, she found her own weight again. The first thing she owned was her anger. It sat up inside her like a second spine. "They wanted me to be a message," she said finally. The words were broken glass, and she said them anyway. "They wanted to leave me swinging for whoever came next." Callum's eyes went quiet and hard at the same time, like creekstones under winter. "To who?" "To everyone," she said. "To girls who look like me and men who trade with us, and anyone who won't bend to their gatherings when they call them community." She swallowed. "To you." He did not argue. "You see any faces?" "Boots," she answered. "The rope, a scar across knuckles, a ring carved like two crossing rails, the smell of juniper chew, the sound of one who straps a gun too low because he wants people to notice the gun and not his eyes." He breathed, once through his nose. "Rail ring," he said softly, and the words were not surprised so much as resigned. "Silas Valk gives those to the men who pay into his Ridge Association." Her smile cut the inside of her mouth where it had already been cut. It tasted of copper and understanding. "Association," she echoed. "Is that the word you use when you want to call a thing good while it's doing harm?" He looked away, jaw tight. "Sometimes we use the right word and it still does harm." A tremor moved through her. It wasn't fear. Her fear had been used up on the rope. This was something that came after fear. This was the second spine settling. She pushed a palm against the dirt and made herself sit straighter. "Where does Silas keep his ring?" she asked. Callum's gaze flicked to the door again. The wind pushed a handful of dust under it as if to listen. He had the look of a man counting doorways and windows without meaning to. On his thumb when he's with his men, on a chain when he's in church, on one's knuckle would do. He bent and gathered the cut rope, coiled it, placed it on a shelf as if it might have to be put on trial later, as if evidence behaved better when it had a dignified place to sit. "You bought this cabin," Arya said. $7. He nodded once. "It belonged to a man named Archer, who took a promissory against crops that never learned how to grow in rock. The county took it for taxes. I took it from the table. The men who did this knew it would be empty." She laid a hand on the plank floor. A faint thread of cold worked into her palm. "No one to walk in. No one but you." Callum tipped his head. He looked like he wanted to say he was sorry out loud, but didn't, because sorry wouldn't be enough, and he didn't plan to stop at that. The lantern swung slightly. Outside, saddle leather creaked somewhere deep in the trees. Arya's eyes found the window slit. She counted heartbeats. There were too many to be wind. Callum lifted the shotgun from beside the door. In the same breath she turned her face toward him and shook her head once. He paused. "Not yet," she breathed. "Not unless we mean to keep going." "I intend to keep going," he said, and the remark could have been about a road or a war. "Then not yet," she said again, "because if we shoot now, we end before we begin. Let them come close and show their boots to us." The words tasted like something older than she was, grandmother counsel. She had learned that when the trap is already sprung, the thing to do is change the trap. Let it close on a different throat. Let it name itself by its own hand. Callum set the shotgun back into the shadow beside the door and moved instead to the table where a ledger lay under a dust skin. He did not open it. He slid it into his coat like a man who knew that written things could be silenced just as easily as throats. He nodded once, quick permission or agreement, and then he did the thing that told her who he was. He blew out the lantern. They stood inside the amber ghost of it, then in the softer breath of the window, hooves. 2. Then a third that stayed behind, as if keeping watch. Voices kept low so they could pretend they were not there. The step, the old rawhide patch on the door complaining, a knuckle rapping out 3 casual taps that wished to be mistaken for neighborly habit. "Archer," a voice said through the plank, "you dead in there or drunk? Deputy Cobb's got a paper needs your mark." Callum's hand found Arya's shoulder, a pressure that asked more than it demanded. She understood and slid down to her knees beside the bed frame. Her breath counted itself. Calm, calm, calm. Callum lifted the latch. The door swung in on its complaint. Daylight made a thin blade of the room for one long breath and then settled on the visitor's face. Not Deputy Cobb, a man in a good shirt that had been placed on a poor body. Silas Valk's man, or Valk himself? No, not yet. This one was the kind they sent before the kind that mattered. A tester. He had careful hair and weak eyes and the wrong hat for the country. "Place came up cheap," Callum said before the man could speak. "I took it, found it lacking in hospitality." The man's eyes went past Callum into the dim interior with the eager ownership of a ferret. "Archer sells a bad bargain," he commented, and smiled a little to let Callum know that he knew what he knew and would like to know more. "You staying?" "Paying," Callum answered and gave a half-smile that might mean anything. "You rang for what?" The man displayed a scrap of paper between 2 fingers, pinched like it stank. "Notice of encumbrance lifted by the ridge." "Association," he said. "You'll want to know it's safe to be here, safe-ish." His knuckles showed a narrow white scar. Arya had to force herself not to rise. The scar felt like a snake in her mouth. Safe-ish, Callum repeated softly, as if he wanted to taste what passed for honesty in the man's speech. And the association is who to thank for such neighbourly care. The ridge keeps trouble. From our doors, the man said. Men pay in and we pay back. The ring on his right hand carried the carving Arya had named. 2 rails crossing, the lines blurred from too much polishing, as if he had tried to rub it into virtue by force. Callum did not look at the ring. And what's the fee for such kindness? Depends how much you earn by minding your business. The man said, depends whose business you mind. He leaned around the threshold, a muscle flexed in his jaw when his eyes lit on the cut rope coiled neat on the shelf. You redecorating? Callum's smile did not move. Found some trash. Put it aside for burning. Burn it fast, the man said. Trash like that tends to tidy up a place the wrong way. He lifted the notice again, as if he were an honorable messenger and not a warning dressed as bureaucracy. You'll want to sign for this. Callum did not reach for the paper. He weighed the man's shadow, which fell narrow and long across the floor. Your name? Ephraim Lyle, he said, like he said it often. You'll see me at the warehouse, at the rail spur, at the church steps when it's Sunday. Arya filed the name and the ring and the scar together like flint and steel. Something sparked inside her and held. Ephraim Lyle smelled of juniper. Chew and something sourer, someone else's money burned on someone else's stove. Callum finally took the paper, folded it without opening it, and tucked it into his vest. Tell Silas Valk I accept the hospitality of men who think the ground belongs to them, he said lightly. I've seen hospitality. This isn't it. Ephraim's smile took a slow retreat. Valk doesn't visit every door, he replied. Men visit for him. The ridge decides who is neighbour and who is nuisance. Then tell the ridge, Callum said, already closing the door. I have neighbours enough. Ephraim let the door touch his sleeve. He stayed there for a heartbeat, measure, then stepped back and tipped his hat as if the gesture had been earned. We'll see how you sleep, he said, and walked away without turning his back, because men who had laid rope learned the shape of consequences and did not like the view. Callum held the door without letting it latch. The space between plank and jamb was exactly wide enough for Arya to see the horses. 3, a 4th in shadow further back, with a rider whose hat held no shape but authority. They would give the test a time and then decide whether to become a visit or an occupation. Callum eased the door shut and returned the bar. When he turned, he found her eyes because she had set them where he would arrive. You know him, he said. I know the ring he wears, she answered, and the scar, and the weight of men who keep weight in their pockets for other men. He nodded once, as if she had said something he carried in his own pockets too. You can run, he offered, and the offer was clean, like a field with no fences. I can buy you a fast horse and send you up into the pines. I've done it. Before, some made it. A breath. Some didn't. Arya felt the rope move in her mind again. It swung with a year's worth of slow years in it. She tasted the metal of it and the dust of it, and the foolishness of believing silence could buy peace. I won't run, she said quietly. She watched the way that sentence landed in him, a small start in the eyes, a tightening in the jaw that didn't quite become disagreement, a stilling of the hands. He didn't argue. He only nodded. But there was relief in it, like the first swallow after a dry day. Then we make the ridge speak its own name, he said. We make it say what it is where it can be heard. She let the words stand in the room beside the cut rope. She touched the bruised ring at her throat. The line of it throbbed and steadied. Choice dug its heels. First, she said, and nodded. Toward the shelf, where he had coiled what tried to bury her, we keep our evidence. Second, we find somebody not paid by the ridge to look at it. Third, she swallowed, we watch their boots until we know which foot they lean on before they lie. You a lawyer? He asked softly, almost a smile on his mouth. I'm a girl who won't fit where they put me, she answered. Law or no law. He considered her for a long breath. I know the sheriff over in San Roque, he said. Walt Harrow. He keeps one hand on his badge and one on the Bible, and when he needs a third hand, he uses his wife's sense. He won't drink with Valk. He won't kneel either, but he won't cross town lines for less than a body, and even then, he'll want the body to talk. She felt her throat ache at the thought of talking. We'll make the rope speak. It already did, Callum said. To me, when I saw it. He looked past her then, to the corner where someone had carved tally cuts into the plank with a steady hand. Archer's tallies. Days he kept himself honest with the lie that tomorrow would be better. Sometimes tomorrow is the lie men choose, Arya said. They spent the next hour putting the room into an order that could be read by someone who had not been here. Callum marked where the chair lay, where the dust had been scuffed into arcs. By boots, where a heel had dug in to push the chair backward. Uriah tied a strip of her scarf around the section of rope that cut her. She hated to touch it, but made herself do it, and then tucked the marked coil into a canvas bag that had once held coffee beans and now held a knight. Callum found a ledger, a page under the bed with a corner torn off. The torn corner rode in his vest already. When he fit it to the page, the tear matched. Across the paper, a penciled list of numbers marched like ants. 3 sets were underlined twice. Beside each, initials EL and a date and a number that might have been dollars and might have been something uglier. Ephraim Lyle, he said, almost gently. Arya watched as he rolled the page and slid it into the canteen's canvas cover. He laced the cover closed. Writing always thought it was safe. It never is. Just before sundown, when the light went the color of blood and then cool copper, they set out. Callum had 2 horses, thin in the ribs but still proud, tails lifted like flags in low wind. He gave her the sorrel and rode the bay, because men who wanted to show they were not like other men did the opposite of what the showy men did. The first mile took all of Arya's breath back. The second mile gave most of it to her again. By the third she could sit without thinking, and then she could watch. The junipers leaned in like green-boned grandmothers. The ground fell away to the wash, and rose again, burned and forgiving. A lark climbed, the sky unrolled, and the world admitted its own bigness without apology. She had not let her other name surface. Not yet. It sat in the back of her mouth like a coin she would not spend until the road demanded it. San Roque lifted, itself out of rock and habit as they came down off the ridge, a line of low buildings that had survived more promises than they deserved, a church with white flaking from its shoulders, a warehouse that had learned how to be 3 buildings when the men who wanted it demanded 3. People on the street looked like they were walking in their own thoughts. When the horses' hooves beat the packed dirt at the edge of town, some faces turned, some didn't. One boy stared openly at Arya and then at the bruised silk at her. He throat and then dropped his eyes like he'd opened the wrong door. Head up, Callum said softly beside her. Not for them, for you. She lifted her chin. The air moved easier when she did. The sheriff's office sat skewed to the main street, as if it wanted to watch out of the corner of its eye. A woman in a green dress sat on the bench out front, peeling an apple with a patience that made the peel into a ribbon. She looked up as they reined in. The knife did not stop. The look she gave them was the kind that could pour water on a fever. Evening, she said. Evening, Mrs. Harrow. Callum returned, slipping from the saddle. She weighed his face. Arya's throat, the knot thickening beneath the silk, the look in Arya's eyes that said, I am still here. She nodded once like she had decided something and called through the open door. Walt, folks. Sheriff Walt Harrow came out like men do, who have spent a day putting fires down one at a time, tired with a margin left in case a bigger fire. Showed up. He was tall, without being tall, and wore his badge like a thing that had been earned and could be taken off when the work deserved it. His hair had given up on order, but his eyes had not. "Callum," he said, "you look like you found trouble, and it's wearing a bruise on its neck." "I found a rope," Callum answered, "and men who think rope is a language." Walt's eyes flicked to Arya. He did not flinch. He didn't look too long either, because staring is a kind of harm. "Miss," he said, and the word did not clip her into something smaller than she was. "I'm sorry the world did that to you." Arya nodded once, in a way that accepted the words without letting them hold her place. "It tried," she said. The voice came hoarse and steady. They went inside. The office smelled of paper and coffee that had learned the taste of a stove too well. On one wall, a map nailed to cedar showed the county lines with a ruler's cruelty. On another wall, a framed sheet of scripture leaned as if it had been made to carry more than it should. A tall iron stove in the corner held the day's old fire. Callum opened the canvas bag and set the coiled rope on the desk. He did not touch it after that. He had learned how evidence liked to accuse men who tried to order it too much. Walt did not touch it either. He circled it with his eyes slowly, as if sight could be fingerprints, when a man wanted to keep both hands clean for a minute longer. "Tell me how it happened," Walt said. Arya told him with as few words as she could buy the truth with. She bought them expensive. Her throat burned and she kept going. When she described the ring with the crossing rails, Walt's jaw moved in a way that chose not to say a curse in front of his wife. When she described the scar across the knuckles, Walt did not look at Callum, which told Arya he would look later, and the look would mean something they did not have to speak yet. "Who found you?" Walt asked gently. "Callum," she said. Walt allowed himself a single nod, like a judge striking a mark he meant to return to. "Where?" "Archer's old cabin in the junipers, off the wash." She tied the map in her mind to the map on his wall and laid the coordinates out with words, and a fingernail on wood. Walt watched the fingernail more than her face. It was respect and a kind of witness. "Who put you there?" he asked last. She swallowed and let the silence name them. "Men who will answer to the ridge," she said. "Maybe to Silas, maybe to their own need to be part of something that lets them forget the names of the people they harm." Mrs. Harrow set a cup of water at Arya's elbow and a folded clean square of cotton beside it. Arya did not want to cry in front of them, so she unfolded the square and let her fingers make a purpose out of smoothing it, then used it to tie her hair back away from the bruised rope ring. The motion steadied her. Getting small things right often does. Walt walked to the map and put a finger on the cabin's place. "You sure you want me to ride there?" he asked. "If I ride with a posse that writes its own story on the way. If I don't ride, I pick the men I take and the road we take, and maybe the story fits the truth better." Arya considered. The rope on the desk. "If you ride loud tonight, Valk rides louder tomorrow and calls it justice." Walt smiled without humor. "You know the man." "I know the pattern," she said. Mrs. Harrow's knife paused over the apple as if the peel needed a thought. "We can start small and careful," she suggested to no one in particular. "A deputy with more eyes than mouth. A preacher to count the boots without saying he's counting. A doctor to examine a rope and say what a rope says when asked." Walt looked at his wife with something that put the Bible on the wall back to rights. "So we begin," he said. It was a beginning only the four of them would ever see as a beginning. Most beginnings look like that when justice is involved. They moved like people who had decided to insist the world tell the truth. Walt drew out a cloth bag and dropped the coil of rope into it with tongs usually used for the stove. He tied it shut and sealed it with wax. The wax cooled like a red coin on the knot. He wrote on the outside in a slow hand, "Evidence, Restraint, Juniper Cabin." Then he drew a second tag and wrote a number on it, the same number that would go in his book, because men who mean to do right, write what they mean. Deputy Reeves will sit on that bag like a broody hen, Walt said. And if anyone reaches for it, he'll bite their hand or bite the bullet, because he's stubborn like rocks. Preacher Collins will stand outside Ephraim Lyle's warehouse, counting who goes in and how long they stay. Dr. Prim will look at that rope and tell me what it did and how long, and whether the hands that tied it loved rope too much. Arya nodded. She could breathe again, without thinking about breathing. That felt like a betrayal to what had happened. How dare breath be easy, and also like a promise to what would come. Then what? Callum asked. Then I call Silas Valk to my office, Walt said, the words simple. And I ask him to explain to me how a ring like that ends up on the hand of a man who carries notice for the ridge, and how the same hand smells like juniper chew and fear. Mrs. Harrow lifted her chin. And if he refuses? Then I walk with God as far as the church steps, Walt said, and with the law the rest of the way. Arya almost smiled. It hurt, and she let it hurt, because some hurts are proof we are not rope. They made a place for her in the back room for the night. The room held a cot, a quilt sewn with crooked squares, and a shelf with more law books than any desert town should be expected to deserve. The quilt smelled faintly of cedar, chips. The first time Arya lay back, the sheet felt like it was made of nettles. By the third breath, it felt like cool water in hot shade. Sleep came and went in thin strips. Each time it went, she touched the bruise at her throat, as if she might press it into a different shape. Each time it came, she dreamed the rope was a snake and the snake was a rope, and both were words made by men who feared their women and their own mouths. Deep in the night, a whisper moved along the street, not wind, the particular hush that belongs to men who do not want to be seen performing righteousness. Arya sat up. A shadow lay long across the door gap under the jamb as the moon shifted. Someone paused outside the office. She held her breath, until the breath hurt again and her anger got up to meet it. Footsteps passed on. The far door, warehouse side, creaked and stopped. Then came the very small sound of a nail being eased from wood. She rose and crossed to the shelf where the law books leaned their tired shoulders together. She set her finger at the names on the spines like she was taking attendance. She did not know which names would show up in the morning. She did not know which names would be called tonight. In a whisper outside, she did not plan to let either be random. The morning came red as a cut. Sheriff Walt had cleaned his desk and brewed coffee. He wore neat tiredness and something that looked like new iron under it. Mrs. Harrow pushed a bowl into Arya's hands. Oats with honey, strong and tender, the way women feed soldiers, even when those soldiers are their own hearts. "Thank you," Arya said. "Don't spend your voice on thanks," Mrs. Harrow returned. "Spend it on naming men who hide behind rings." Outside, men started their days as if all days were alike. A broom sound sketched the street. Someone laughed too loud and made it sound like weather. Down at the spur, a train coughed and settled. Ephraim Lyle stood on the platform counting crates with his eyes and pretending he had been born to do it. Walt chose his time. He did not walk to the warehouse at noon when heat makes men brave. He went at 9 when men believe they are unobserved. By the day's pride, he took Callum. He nodded to Arya to follow after a span with Mrs. Harrow, because witnesses should enter like their feet agree with each other. "Sheriff," Ephraim called when he saw them. "You come to admire commerce? San Roque is on its way to Worth, and I'm the man clearing the road. I came to ask about a ring," Walt said, as pleasant as a man at breakfast. Ephraim blinked. He finished a sum he had started because men like him would lose their speech entirely if you took arithmetic away. "A ring, the one on your hand," Walt said. "The rails crossing, what oath goes with it? I like to know what men swear, as a habit." Ephraim lifted his hand the way a man does when he would like you to notice something, and also fear. It Friendship, he said. Neighborliness. Mutual defense. Defense against what? Walt asked mildly. Against people who don't know how to be neighbors, Ephraim said, very sure of himself now. Like ropes, Walt asked. Ropes make poor neighbors. Ephraim's smile slipped as if it had been oiled. You should talk to Silas, he said. He uses words better than I do. I prefer to talk to men I can see, Walt returned, and then he lifted his voice just enough to carry to the men stacking crates along the spur. Silas Valk! The next silence had a shape. It made a path through the crowd and up the warehouse steps. Silas Valk walked out wearing a coat that had been chosen for a colder season and a face that had been chosen for war. He was handsome, the way certain snakes are. Sleek, admired, cold. His eyes weighed the street and found it acceptable. His mouth weighed the sheriff and decided to smile. Sheriff Harrow, he said, it is always a pleasure to see the law, even when the law cannot read. Then teach me, Walt said. Tell me what I should read into a coil of rope found in a cabin you have an interest in. Silas's gaze moved over the watchers and settled on Callum with a small crescent of disdain. You purchased property whose value you do not know how to manage, he said to Callum, then turned the disdain into a showman's grin for the crowd. A habit with certain men. Callum did not take the bait. He looked at the ring on Silas's left thumb. It wasn't there. It hung instead from a chain at his neck, the rails crossing over his sternum like a sermon men in certain pews like to preach silently. Mrs. Harrow and Arya stepped up to the platform edge, not near enough to bruise, near enough to speak without. Lifting their voices, Arya looked at the ring, and then at Silas's eyes, and then at Ephraim's hands, which had started to fidget, and then forced themselves to remember that fidgeting is language too. You let your men tie messages, Mr. Valk? Arya asked, and the question carried not just her voice, but the voices of women who had not been asked anything in years. Silas's smile cooled. I don't take questions from spectators, he said, and tried to make the pause sound like a period instead of a word he didn't dare use. His eyes flicked across the bruised wrap at her throat. He filed the information. Men like him always filed. If you've had an experience, take it to the church. We deal in order here. Arya stepped closer. Order, she said, looking not at him but at Ephraim, like an order for rope, 3 cuts, delivered after dark. She spoke the dates as she had read them on the ledger page and watched Ephraim's left eye twitch like a rabbit trying to become a rock. Silas laughed, and the sound rang fresh as a pistol shot. Sheriff, you brought me your own entertainment. He spread his hands. Why do men like you insist on turning the market square into a stage? Because stages have better light, Walt said. He lifted his hand. Deputy Reeves stepped forward with the cloth bag and the wax seal and the scripture on the wall of the sheriff's office, like a judge's nod behind him, even here in the street. We found this in a cabin, Walt said to Silas, not opening. The bag, we have a doctor who will say a human throat was in it, and for how long, and whether the knot was made by hands that make them for sport. Silas's beautiful mouth kept the smile. His eyes had stopped smiling some time ago. And who, he asked, voice sweet, will say who was in it? Arya untied the silk at her throat. The murmur that moved across the crowd had the shape of a curtain going up. Somebody said her name wrong, and somebody else corrected it, and somebody else said, no, it is the other name, the one that belongs to the mountains, and then somebody else said, both names are hers. Silas watched the crowd learn to look. His lip touched the edge of a snarl, and then decided against it. Men get into trouble with women who make shows, he said softly enough that only the front row could hear, and yet all of them did. But He tapped his chest where the ring lay against his shirt. I attend to business. Sheriff, you mean to arrest me for jewelry? Walt's eyebrows made a line. "I mean to ask you about a scar," he replied, "on Ephraim Lyle's knuckles. I mean to ask him why he smells like juniper chew and fear. I mean to ask why a ledger page in Archer's cabin contains dates that match the nights my deputy heard wagons at your spur after midnight when the books say there were none." The crowd did what crowds do when truth starts to put its teeth in. It took sides without moving. Some men folded their arms like gates closing. Some women planted feet like fences. One child climbed the pump and wrapped his arms around the crossbar, so his memory could later tell him where he was when something began. Silas lifted his hands to make peace even as he stuck a knife in it. "You are a decent man, Sheriff," he said. "Let me solve this for you. There is no rope, and there is no cabin, and there is certainly no girl." He made his eyes go blind where she stood and then deliberately turned his back on her, as if to include the town in his performance. "There is only a man named Callum Thorne who bought worthless land and would like it to be worth more. So he brings you a bag and a story and a girl with a bruised neck he found God knows where, and he says, 'Help me.' And you, Sheriff, you want to help. You like to help. But you cannot help men who seek to make failure into a law." The cruel neatness of the speech moved through the crowd like a hand parting water. It found purchase where men were tired of being asked to look at what hurt them and wanted instead to be told who to point at. Callum stepped forward into the open the way a man does when he has decided to be counted, whether the counting is fair or not. "Silas," he said evenly, "I can prove I cut that rope where I found it. I can prove the chair wasn't built by me, and the knot wasn't tied by me, and the ledger I took out of Archer's floor had its corner torn off long before. My boots learned that door. What I can't prove is whether you sleep soundly. God will have to tell us that." A boy in the back laughed like a bell jerked by a string. Silas's eyes found him and made him quiet with a glance. Men who collect men can do that. He shifted, and in the shift the ring slid under his shirt and glinted, rails crossing over his sternum like two small swords. There was a mark in the metal where a knife had struck it once, hard, and failed to cut. Arya saw it. She had seen that notch in the lantern light in Archer's cabin when a man reached to steady a chair with the hand that cut the air and said, "Message." The notch turned the ring into a witness. "Mr. Valk," Arya said, quiet and steady, "would you show us your ring?" He spread his hands. "You want my jewelry? Take it." He reached to the chain and drew the ring out and held it toward her. He was smiling again. He was the kind of man who could hand you the thing that undid him and be sure you would fumble it. She didn't take it. She looked at the nick. "You hit it against something hard," she said to the air more than to him. "Not a table, not a door. Something narrow. Steel. It left that wedge." She lifted her hand and put two fingers apart in the air to measure the depth. "The edge of a lantern hood. The one in Archer's cabin has the same notch. I saw it last night when a man bumped it and apologized to the glass." She did not say sorry for the rope, because men like Silas do not say that word to anyone but themselves in mirrors. Silas's hand closed on the ring just a fraction. It was enough for Walt to see. Sheriff's eyes learn how to tell time by gestures. "You have something to say?" Walt asked him. Silas's mouth made a clean line. "Nothing that would correct ignorance without rewarding it," he said. "Sheriff, you are making me tedious." "Then show me your hands," Walt returned. "If they are cleaner than mine, I'll go home." The street held its breath. Silas glanced down at his hands as if he had never seen them before, as if they had grown there last night out of other men's work. He lifted them. They were beautiful. They were almost perfect. But there, along the knuckles of the right hand, a narrow white scar ran in a line that could have been a quirk of skin if it had been placed by God and not by rope. "Ephraim," Walt said, without moving his eyes from Silas. "Show me yours." Ephraim's hand shook as if coffee had claimed them. He lifted them. Scar, white, narrow, a mirror cut. Walt nodded to Deputy Reeves. Reeves stepped forward and opened the cloth bag for the doctor's eyes only. Dr. Prim, who had slipped through the crowd at some point like a dry wind, looked in and blinked once slowly. "Hemp," he said. "New. The knot is—" He cleared his throat. "Practiced." Silas's smile came back as if it had just changed coats out of everyone's sight. "You are putting on a play, Sheriff," he said softly. "Plays end when the audience goes home." He turned to the crowd like a preacher preparing to dismiss a service. "Go on. Go with God. We'll do business tomorrow." That was when the gun went off. It was a small gun, tucked in someone's pocket, because they were the kind of man who wanted to be part of something without taking the risk of being the center of it. The shot cracked the space between Silas and Walt into a glass that fell inward and outward at the same time. For one fraction of a second, nobody moved. Then everything moved. People ducked. A horse reared and dragged its reins. Mrs. Harrow spun Arya behind the pump with a strength that made Arya understand what wives hold when their men hold badges. Deputy Reeves grabbed the cloth bag and dove toward the stove in his head because there was no stove in the street, so he invented one. Dr. Prim lay down of his own accord and made himself smaller than a man can be unless he is used to operating on children. Walt had already found the shooter with his eyes by the time the echo was finished. He didn't draw, he stepped, and the step put a barrel against a coat and a man against the warehouse wall. "Hold," Walt said, and the word, quiet, unadorned, held. The man dropped the pistol like it had always belonged to somebody else. Silas's face had gone flat, all the beauty knocked from it by the prospect of things going off script. He looked very briefly like a boy with his hand in a jar. Then the look became a calculation again. He lifted his palms, not in surrender, but to show he held no fire. Ephraim's jaw worked. His eyes skittered like mice on a slick floor toward the alley, toward anyone in the crowd who looked like they might be entrusted with a lie. His hands came up too, and the scar showed and did not ask forgiveness. Arya moved without thinking. It felt like the rope burned at her neck and pushed her forward. She stepped out from behind the pump and into the seam the crowd had left for truth. She spoke not to Walt or to Silas, but to everyone else. "I am not a message," she said, and the sound carried because silence arranged itself to hear it. She touched the bruise at her throat and did not flinch, and did not lower her chin, and did not apologize for having a body the world had tried to end. "I am a person with a name older than yours and a name, you can say. I'm standing here because a man who bought a cabin for $7 chose to cut a rope you meant the wind to finish. If you let that rope speak for you, then you are the ones who can't read. If you let it speak for your God, then you built the wrong church." Her voice rippled outward like a stone thrown proper. It hit faces she would never know in ways she would not get to measure. Walt's hand eased against the shooter's chest and made room for the law to breathe without breaking. Mrs. Harrow watched Silas's eyes and saw where fear learned to sew itself into silk. "Sheriff," Silas said, and his mouth had the whiteness of a knuckle scar now. "Are you going to let her stand there and talk?" Walt asked. "Yes." He cocked his head. "Unless you'd like to explain the notch on your ring." Silas's throat moved. The crowd, which had begun to relax into its favorite positions, tightened again in a way that felt like a loop pulling against its own knot. Deputy Reeves, who had gone very still, very square, very rock-like, lifted the cloth bag so the red wax caught the sun where everyone could see it. Dr. Prim stood up and held his hand over the opening as if he were blessing a sacrament. And then the second shot came from the alley to the left. It did not hit a man. It hit the rope bag. Jar. Wax seal shattered. The cloth jerked. Hemp spilled in the dust like a snake uncoiling to remember what it had been made to do. Arya's breath stopped. Callum's hand moved half an inch toward the place where a gun would be if he had chosen to carry it openly. Mrs. Harrow's fingers tightened on Arya's arm and then let go as if to say, "We cannot hold each other through every bullet. We have to learn to stand." Walt swung toward the alley and then halted because swinging is for men who are chasing. He was not chasing. He was deciding whether to split a town wide open in daylight. Silas smiled, and it was so small a smile you could have mistaken it for a lie dying somewhere hard to see. "Pity," he breathed. "Evidence gets nervous." Callum stared at the ruined bag, as if he could force time to pick hemp out of dust and reseal a coin of red onto a knot. He could not. He looked at Arya. The question that wanted to speak in him, "Do you still want to do this?" died on his tongue because questions like that insult the people you ask them of. Arya bent. She gathered the rope with her own hands. She did not care that men watched. She did not care that the rope remembered. Her skin. She lifted it. Dust streaked her palm, her wrist, the scar ring at her throat. She found the piece marked by her scarf strip and held it up so the crowd could see the bruises twin and the clean place where the scarf had protected it. "Evidence keeps its nerve when people do," she said. Silas looked at her and saw, perhaps for the first time, the reach of a rope when it fails. Something old and reptile in him recoiled and plotted. Walt's voice came calm and cutting. "Silas Valk, Ephraim Lyle," he said, as if reading from a list that had been waiting in the back of his throat. "You will take yourselves to my office. You will give me your hands and your rings and your boots, and my wife will sit you down and pour you strong coffee and make you think you've come for hospitality when what you've come for is your life. If you refuse, I will walk you there. If you run, I will ride you down." The alley made a sound like a snake in straw. Walt didn't flinch. "If your friends shoot again," he added, "I'll bury you and invite them to the service so they can learn how to weep." Silas smiled his snake smile. "You can't take me in on talk," he said. "Talk is how towns decide whether to hang men or let them eat," Walt answered. "Today, I am choosing the second." He tilted his head toward the office. "Walk." Silas looked at the crowd and saw that even the ones he could count like coins had turned slightly away from him, that small quarter turn of the human body. "That means we have begun to listen to something besides our fear." He went because men like him do not know how not to go when an audience has refused to applaud. They moved back through the heat like a procession you hope to wake from. People watched and tried not to. Deputy Reeves held the slashed bag like a man carrying a baby that had been dropped but not broken. Dr. Prim walked with his hand on the shoulder of the shooter Walt had pressed against the wall, as if to teach that man what a human hand feels like when it means not to kill you. Arya took 2 steps and the world tilted. Callum was there, a hand against her back, not possessive, not crowding. "Easy," he said. "We've still got ground." She nodded once, twice, again. The rope was heavy in her hands. It would get heavier. She had known that the first time she saw it, before it knew her throat. She set the coil against her hip like a woman would set a child. She walked. They were almost to the office door when the last sound of the morning came, the sound that cut through the others and took them apart. The fast hammer of hooves, the drum of many horses moving as one, turning the corner like a black wave. The Ridge Association came into the street at a canter. Dust climbed their legs and rolled down in sheets. Men leaned from their saddles in showcoats and prayer pins, guns low at their thighs and rings glinting like teeth. They had not come for talk. They had come for retrieval. They had come to cut a town out of itself and set it down again in a shape that would feed them more easily. Mrs. Harrow stepped in front of Arya without thinking. Callum stepped 1 pace right, so that if shooting started, he could put his body where bullets live and at least show them they had been seen by a man before they took what they came for. Walt stood in the center of the street and did not move. Silas, halfway to the office door, turned like a cat scolded by rain. Ephraim's hands lifted and dropped and lifted again. The men at the front of the association wore their rails on their thumbs, where no pulpit could pretend not to notice. The one in the middle had a scar that ran across his knuckles and then across his mouth, connecting the two like a railroad on a map. He drew his horse up hard enough to make it dance, and laughed. "Message carried," he said, looking at Arya, like he was reading a receipt he meant to sign. "Now we'll finish the delivery." She tightened her fingers on the rope until the dust ground into her skin and made a paste of grit and memory. Fear tried to climb her spine. The second spine met it and told it there was no room. The men began to fan out to encircle the office, faces all angles and performative calm. Callum didn't lift a gun. He lifted his voice. "Whose church will let you back in after today?" The question was so rude, it jarred two of them sideways. Rudeness, properly used, is a justice sometimes. The man with the scar mouth grinned wider. "The church that likes its tithes heavy," he said, and tapped his breastbone where a ring could hang. The sorrel under Arya stamped once and blew, catching her worry like a scent and returning it to her as steam. She stroked the horse's neck with the hand that didn't hold rope. The horse settled, and something inside her did too. The association's circle tightened. Walt lifted his hand as if blessing baptism. "San Roque," he said without raising his voice. "If there are men among you who think the ridge is law, step forward. If there are men who think the ridge is commerce, step aside. The rest of you, stay where you are and watch." The street obeyed, because sometimes the very human need to belong can be made to remember it belongs first to the truth. The scar-mouth rider looked past them all to Silas, who stood with his shoulders careful. "Do you want me to speak for you?" he asked cheerfully. Silas smiled with his eyes closed. "You already are," he said. The rider swung down, slow, made a show of removing his gloves. His right hand had a scar white as salt. He looked at Arya, and the look said that he had been in the cabin, and that he had made the knot laugh, and that if he could, he would put language like that on every woman who didn't know when to hold her breath. "What's your name?" Arya asked him, "because that is the one thing men like him never expect you to demand." He blinked, then smirked, and then let it harden into something he planned to own. "Harlan Pike." She nodded once, as if blessing the name with knowledge that would hang on it for the rest of the man's life. Walt stepped half toward him and half toward the crowd. "Harlan," he said, "you planning to shoot your way past a lawman into a building where coffee is being poured by my wife?" Harlan's eyes glittered low. "Sheriff," he said, and tilted his head. "You planning to bury your woman in her own kitchen?" Walt's mouth made a line that matrimony and scripture had taught him to soften. It did not soften. "If you lift a gun," he said, "you will not have time to aim it before it stops being yours." Harlan laughed, sure of himself, sure of the numbers, sure of the way towns fold when enough boots stamp in the same rhythm. He flicked a glance at Silas that was both question and promise. Silas didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He only removed the ring from its chain and slid it, swift and practiced, onto his thumb. Arya saw the notch catch the sun. The rope in her hands remembered. The air around them went still, like the inside of a held breath. Harlan Pike looked from the ring to the sheriff, to the rope, to Arya's throat. He smiled like a fox to whom the hen has just explained the doctrine of non-violence. "Take her," he said to the circle. "And take the bag. We'll show them what order looks like." The circle compacted. Hooves bit the street. A hand reached for the rope. Arya stepped back, hit the pump, and felt cold iron against her spine. The world narrowed to the space between. Her breath and the palm almost on her wrist. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you." Bull, the word, fell into dust, like a bead of rain on hot iron, and then everything ran at once. The hand that reached for the rope met Arya's palm before it found hemp. She didn't think. Her body remembered the knot and refused it. She drove, her knuckles down into the small bones between the stranger's fingers. Something popped. The man hissed and yanked back, and the coil stayed with her. Harlan Pike's smile folded, then sharpened. "Take her," he repeated, too calm for the heat, and the circle tightened again. Walt Harrow didn't draw. He stood anchored like a cottonwood that had learned to drink flood. His voice traveled as if it had always known the road between one human ear and the next. "Any man who puts a hand on that woman," he said, "puts his hand on me first." "And gladly," Harlan said, and lifted his palm in a theatrical offer, inviting the shot that would justify everything. "No," Mrs. Harrow said, to Walt, to Harlan, to the street, to the air. She didn't move from in front of Arya. Her apron made a flag no army would dare to snatch. "We're not writing your blood script." Callum took 1 pace left, 1 pace forward, and found the pump handle with his heel. He felt iron, felt leverage. "You brought numbers," he told Harlan. "We brought a town." "Your town sells rope," Harlan said. "Not anymore," Arya answered, and her voice carried scars like medals. The association horses minced, catching. Nerves. Men adjusted reins the way cowards adjust reasons. Ephraim Lyle swallowed so hard his Adam's apple bobbed like a cork. Silas Valk's thumb stroked the rail ring, the nick shining like a confession. Walt raised one hand above his hat, the old circuit rider's sign for quiet, and kept it there until the street became a held note. "Harlan Pike," he said, shaping the name as if it were already an entry in a ledger. "You are in my town. You will not take anyone from my step. You want an arrest? You'll get a summons. You want a fight? You'll get a grave." "Sheriff," Harlan said mildly, "your talk is pretty, and I hate pretty lies." He flicked 2 fingers. 2 riders peeled toward the office door to seize Silas back out of Law's porch and recrown him with menace. Callum moved first. He kicked the pump handle sideways, and the iron lever slammed into one rider's shin, with a sound like breaking hickory. The man toppled, his boots stuck in the stirrup. The bay horse flinched and dragged him, then checked, trained better than its rider. The second rider grabbed for his gun and found the muzzle of Walt's Colt looking into his future. He stopped. "Back," Walt said softly. The man backed. Harlan's eyes glittered with the dangerous joy of men who think chaos is proof they're winning. "All right, then," he breathed, and slid from the saddle like a man stepping into a bath. "If it's theater you want, Sheriff, I'll give you theater." He walked toward Arya, palms wide, the half-circle of riders shifting to open a lane that looked like courtesy and smelled like trap. Arya did not retreat. She put the coil of rope on the pump pedestal and set her hand on it. Claim, not surrender. Her throat ached with the memory of hemp. Her spirit held it like a light. "Ask me my name," she told him. Harlan paused. The smile returned. "Girl, what is your name?" She let the first name come, the paper one, the name men scribble, Arya Quintero, and the mountain name rode underneath it like a current. "Say it right," she added. He obliged with a careful mockery, and because he said it wrong on purpose, the mountain name rose in her chest to steady her. He saw it rise and mistook it for fear. "Give the sheriff his bag," Harlan told Deputy Reeves without looking. "We're going to walk this rope to the river and see if it floats." "Reeves," Walt said, without moving his eyes from Harlan. "Staying," the deputy answered, his voice like dry granite. He tucked the slashed bag against his ribs and did not blink when a rider's horse breathed damp heat along his sleeve. Silas shifted, measuring. If Harlan succeeded, Silas could inherit the victory. If Harlan failed, Silas could disavow the method. Power prefers to live in parentheses. "Here is what's going to happen," Harlan announced. You're going to move aside. The lady is going to remember how to walk. We're going to take back what belongs to order. And in the end, you're going to thank us for tidying your mess." Arya heard the word lady turned into a leash and decided it would never fit her. She moved her hand from the rope to the pump handle and pushed. Iron groaned. Water surged in the throat of the pump and spilled cold and clean across the dust at Harlan's boots. He stopped. The circle paused with him. "Go wash," she said. "You smell like a lie." Laughter cracked. Nervous, delighted, afraid of itself. Harlan's mouth made a white line that matched his scar. He took the final step and reached, fast as a striking bird. Callum hit him. It wasn't a brawler's haymaker. It was a carpenter's straight line from shoulder to knuckle. Harlan's head snapped sideways, hat spinning, ringed thumb flaring a flash of sun. He tottered and recovered, tasting his own iron. He looked at Callum and saw, not a hired rider, not a scared clerk, a man with corners and a centre. "Who are you to interrupt a civic program?" Harlan asked pleasantly, blood bright on his teeth. "Callum Thorne," Callum said, "the man who paid $7 for a ruin so that apparently you could come and ruin it again." Harlan dabbed at his mouth with the back of his hand and found more blood. "You're the buyer," he mused. "Then you're also the bill." His eyes ticked to Silas. "Settle?" Silas smiled like a cashier. "By all means." Harlan drew. He was fast the way a rattler is fast, only dangerous because you give him your ankle. Callum didn't reach for his gun. He stepped inside Harlan's drawer and knocked his wrist with the bone of his forearm. The pistol fired into the street, shredding a poster on the warehouse wall and announcing to everyone who had not yet chosen a side that sides had been chosen without them. Callum's second hand trapped Harlan's thumb. The ring bit Callum's palm and twisted. Harlan snarled. The gun dropped. It would have gone off again if Walt hadn't already stepped and put his boot on it. Then the world splintered. These association lines surged. The townspeople leaned inward. Mrs. Harrow shoved Silas through the office door by the elbow as easily as if he were a boy with muddy shoes. Deputy Reeves braced for hands and got them. Dr. Prim shouted, "Down!" to anyone capable of obeying 2 letters. Through it, Arya kept her eyes on Harlan Pike's scar. Not the pretty white line on his knuckles, the one across his mouth. Men who joke about rope get that second scar when something unfunny finally speaks back. She saw it pull. She stepped forward and put the coil at his feet. "Look at it," she said. He did, and his face made the brief, involuntary shape of a man who has fallen out of a dream where he was the hero. "Pick it up," she added. "Why?" he asked, surprised into honesty. "Because you need to know the weight of the thing you worship." His hand moved without his permission. He lifted the rope by the cut end Callum's knife had made clean. His palm blackened with dust. The nicked ring flashed. A drop of water from the pump fell, landed on the nick, and sat there like a tear that didn't know whose cheek it belonged to. "You see?" Arya asked, quiet. "It remembers you." "Enough," Silas said sharply from the doorway. Brittle patience snapped clean. "Sheriff, control your spectacle." Walt didn't look back. "San Roque," he called. "You see Harlan Pike with a gun. I don't. You see a sheriff with a gun. You do." He glanced at Harlan. "Ride away." Harlan's chest rose. Pride loaded the chamber. "Not without—" "Ride," Walt repeated. "Or I put irons on you, and we find out whether your men love you as much as you think they do." The circle shuddered, loyalty rattling against self-preservation. Harlan read the truth in his men's faces and found it unflattering. He flicked the rope away like a snake and reached down for his hat. He placed it on his head with exaggerated calm, stepped back to his horse, and swung up in a single rage-built motion. "This isn't done," he said. "Good," Walt returned. "Then we can do it right next time." Harlan wheeled his mount. "Silas?" he asked, that single word a challenge and an invitation and an accounting. Silas touched the ring in a motion that might have been a pledge or a goodbye. Go, he said softly. I'll tidy. Harlan laughed once, short, ugly, and spurred away. The association broke like a comb in rough hair. Some followed, some pretended they had never arrived. Dust settled with a conscience. When quiet came, it came in layers, horse breath, sleeve rustle. Someone's cough trying to be a laugh and failing. Arya stood still until her hands stopped shaking. Only then did she realize she'd pressed the coil so hard the hemp had left its circle on her palms. Mrs. Harrow stepped close. "Come," she said, not as an order and not as a plea, but as a bridge. "We'll tend your neck and your hands, while the men tend their pride." "I can speak," Arya said, "and I will." "You will," Mrs. Harrow agreed, "with salve and water." Inside the office, the light was kind again. Silas Valk sat in a chair as if he owned the chair and the man who had built it and the woman who had scrubbed the floor beneath it. His composure had patched the tear Harlan's miscalculation made. He was already editing what had happened for the benefit of those who prefer clean minutes to dirty truth. Walt stood. He did not sit behind the desk because men like Silas understand tables better than they understand eyes. "I have two choices," he said. "Treat this as an investigation or a siege." "Sheriff," Silas replied, "you don't have a siege. You have a story, and you're entertaining your town with it." "Then help me trim it," Walt said. "Explain the ring. Explain Ephraim's knuckles. Explain why a doctor will say a human throat told that rope what to do." Silas leaned back. "I explain nothing," he said. "I buy, I sell, I secure. A sheriff arrests, a judge adjudicates, a preacher scolds. Everyone sings their stanza, don't sing mine." "You make the music that drowns the rest," Mrs. Harrow said calmly from where she wrapped Arya's neck with clean linen and salve. "That smelled of pine. That's not singing. That's noise." Silas's eyes flicked to her and away, the practiced courtesy of a man who has taught himself not to be taught by women. He returned to Walt. "Do you have charges?" "I have questions," Walt answered. "And I have witnesses." He nodded to Arya. "Begin." Arya told it again. The room made the listening space she needed. She did not add or subtract. When she finished, Silas's smile had resumed its efficient shape. "Move to arrest me, Sheriff," he said lightly, "and you'll arrest half your tax base." Walt's eyes crinkled, though nothing near them was funny. "A man once told me," he said, "that if your money requires rope to compound, you have the wrong bank." He looked to Callum. "You willing to testify you cut that rope?" "Yes," Callum said, simple as a nail-tapped flush. "Then we'll test," Walt decided. "Dr. Prim will speak to the rope. Preacher Collins will speak to the ledger. Of those midnight wagons, Mrs. Harrow will speak to every woman within a day's ride, and you will find you are outnumbered." Silas rose, slow. "The ridge outnumbers your hymns," he said. "And if numbers fail, there are other measures." Walt stepped forward until the two men could have shared a breath. "I know one measure you fear," he said softly. "It's called daylight." Silas's cheek twitched. "We will see how daylight treats you when the rail company reads the reports I write." He smoothed his coat, the gesture neat as accounting. "Arya Quintero," he added, rolling the name as if tasting it for future use. "If you choose to move about at night in men's cabins, you are liable to be misunderstood." Arya stood. The salve cooled the fire at her throat, but another fire began in her chest and did not plan to be polite. "I choose to live," she said. "That is all the misunderstanding I will indulge." Silas smiled as if to say, "How quaint." "Courage. Go," Walt told him. "But not far. You'll be back under summons before supper." Silas gave a little bow that mocked both law and supper, and left with the unhurried long stride of men who trust other men to sweep up behind them. Silence filled the doorway he vacated. Walt exhaled slowly. Dr. Prim checked his hands. as if blood can appear by conjure when arrogance is in a room. Deputy Reeves looked at the slashed bag, and then at the window, and then at the slashed bag again, like a man guarding a grave and waiting for the dirt to move. "We just made a road, Mrs. Arrow murmured to Arya. "Now we walk it." They walked it with the urgency of people who know night travels faster than day. By noon, Collins had taken his small black book to the spur and written down the names of men who entered the warehouse and, by an old trick of shepherding, the names of the men those men feared. By one, Dr. Prim had spliced the rope into 3 sections and scraped fibers to look at under a traveler's lens. He told Walt what he saw: a fresh twist, a practiced knot, the imprint of a laced boot heel on one strand, as if a man had leveraged his weight to make the chair go. By 2, Mrs. Harrow had filled the back room with women who listened without talking over one another. They wrote their own ledger. Men who had come home late with rope smell on them, bruises they had called clumsy, nights the church ladies had found a girl on a porch and pretended she was resting. By 3, Harlan Pike was at the livery, buying more cartridges and smiling too much. By 4, Ephraim Lyle found his ledger corner missing and looked suddenly much older. By 5, Silas Valk stood alone at the end of the spur, where the wind turns everything into disbelief, and practiced the smile that makes juries want to be forgiven. Callum and Arya went back to the cabin. "Why?" Mrs. Harrow had demanded when Callum said as much. "Because," he answered, "a place remembers better than people." Arya didn't say aloud the second reason. Because breathing in that room without the rope made the rope smaller. Because walking where she had almost swung would teach her feet to carry the rest of the way. They reached the junipers before the shadows stretched long. The cabin looked smaller in afternoon than in evening. The ghost of the lantern hung in the air, as if it had lived there forever, and would be there long after men forgot how to make fire. Arya stepped inside first. She set her palm to the doorframe and felt the notch where a knife point had once rested when a man had paused to think. A bad thought. She went to the shelf and lifted the coil they'd left as decoy, rope enough to tell a story to men who didn't listen. The real pieces of evidence were sealed back at Walt's office. This coil she held now was something to practice on. She threaded her scarf strip through it again and tied it, her fingers slow and exact. "Show me," she told Callum. "How you cut." He took the blade and the breath. "I didn't hesitate," he said, and then his voice broke on the smallest stone in the stream, "except for the time it takes to pray." "Who do you pray to?" she asked, not to test, to know the shape of the man who had bought her another dawn. "To the God that listens even when I don't deserve it," he said. "To my mother's stubbornness, to my father's silence, to my own hands sometimes." He gave her the knife. "Do it." She let the rope bite her hands and then let the steel speak. When the hemp parted, something in her unclenched that she had not named until it moved. "Again," she said, and did it twice more. The third time she didn't flinch at the sound the rope makes when it gives up pretending it can be a throat. Enough. They walked the small room like men walk a field they mean to plant differently. Callum knelt and studied the floor where Boot Heels had written half a sentence searching for grammar. He found the impression of a spur rowel and pressed his finger into the dirt to compare widths. "Not Harlan," he said. "He wears Spanish rowels. This is factory cut." He shifted. "Ephraim." Arya stood at the window and looked out through the rawhide patch. "They'll come back here," she said, "not because they need to, because men like that can't leave a mirror uncovered." Callum nodded. "Then we should leave something worth seeing." They did. They set the decoy rope where a man would reach for it and feel himself clever. They chalked the edge of the lantern hood to show a new nick if a ring struck it again. They buried a second small linen bag in the hearth's ash, empty, meaningless, so that men who love finding secrets would find the wrong one. And in a jar whose clay mouth had been cracked like a grin, Aria tucked a folded scrap of her scarf so that she could look at that shelf in 3 days and know whether the wind had done the moving or hands had. When they rode back, the light had cooled to the color of tin. San Roque felt like a house with too many rooms open. Collins met them at the edge of the street with his black book, the corner of his mouth carved upward with grim satisfaction. "Names," he said, and handed Callum a list. And Callum didn't. "Smile, because some victories are receipts you file in a ledger marked courage costs." Inside the office, Walt had placed 3 cups on the desk, one for law, one for medicine, one for witness. He poured coffee dark and hot and strong enough to stand a spoon. "Dr. Prim." The doctor tapped his notes. "Fresh hemp, no smut, not used before. Not is a hangman's variant, not quite professional, but practiced. Time in constriction, minutes that felt like miles, the neck that wore it. Small, strong, skin abraded on the right side where the twist dragged. He coughed, there are fine hairs, black." Aria lifted her chin. "Mine," she said. "Leave them in." She caught Mrs. Harrow's eye and saw the flinch. At that request, and the deeper understanding in the flinch, preacher, Walt said, Collins opened the little black book. On the nights marked in that ledger scrap our friend found, 10 wagons came to the spur, when the books say none. Men went in with crates and came out with cash eyes. Ephraim stood at the door and smiled as if he had no teeth. Silas did not appear, or else he appeared hiding in the window glass. "Women," Mrs. Harrow said without prompting. 37 stories since breakfast. Ropes used for discipline, ropes used for fun, ropes used for teachings. None of those words mean what men think they mean when they make their mouths say them. Walt nodded once. "We push now," he said. "Slow enough to be read, fast enough that no midnight correction can edit our book." "How?" Callum asked. "Summons," Walt replied. "For Silas, for Ephraim, for Harlan, for 6 names in. Collins' book, whose wives told mine the truth, and whose boots Dr. Prim will match to Prince at the cabin. We seat a citizens' board tomorrow, 10 o'clock. Open hearing. We let the town decide whether it belongs to law or to the Ridge." "You'll get guns," Dr. Prim warned. "I'll get eyes," Walt said, "and that will be enough." Aria stood, standing hurt and felt right. "I'll speak." "You will," Mrs. Harrow agreed, "with a chair behind you to catch your breath when truth knocks it out again." Night came early, not because the sun was done, but because men were. The Ridge used darkness like ink. It poured along the alleys and out from under wagons and into conversations that should have been brief. It gathered under Silas's porch and waited for cavalry that had already gone home to practice smiles. Callum sat on the bench outside the office with his hat in his lap and his hands the way a man folds them when he sorely wishes to use them. Aria sat beside him, linen cool at her throat, the coil of rope on the desk inside like a storm contained in a glass. "You could have shot him," she said, not accusing. "I could have," he answered. "I've done worse for less." He thought of his father's silence and the rail yard where he learned to keep his fists. He thought of a boy he wasn't anymore. He didn't say those thoughts because she'd asked him not with the shape of her life. "You didn't," she said. "I didn't," he agreed. "Thank you," he nodded, "for not letting him take you by your name." She smiled crookedly. "Names are hooks. I keep the ones that catch fish." They didn't notice the boy until he spoke, a thin shadow with a voice that whistled from a broken tooth. "Ma says not to talk to you," he said to Aria, and then added it like a secret. "Between conspirators, so I talked first." "What's your name?" Aria asked gently. "Jory," he said. "I seen a man with a wagon of rope go to Silas's last night. He didn't knock. He went round to the back like a rat." He handed her a marble, blue as a robin's egg. "You can borrow this. It sees through cracks." She took it gravely. "I'll return it when it's done looking," she promised, and the boy nodded like a court clerk and vanished into the lane. Inside, the rope lay quiet and loud. Walt came to the doorway and looked up the street toward the church steeple and down the street toward the spur, and then at the square of starlight on the worn threshold. "Tomorrow," he said, "we put wood under this town and ask it to burn clean." He went back in. The lamp dimmed. Arya and Callum sat with the night, which had many more words to say, and no plan to say them softly. Toward midnight, footsteps scraped along the alley beside the office, the careful rhythm of men trying to walk like cats. Deputy Reeves lifted his head. Mrs. Harrow, in the back room, leaned her hand on the table once, and then lifted it, as if steadying the whole building along with the cup that sat there. Callum tapped his hat brim down. Arya set Jory's marble in the crack beneath, the sill so the moonlight could teach it how to see. Silence stretched thin. A nail squealed slow. The window latch moved a thumb's width. "Walt," Mrs. Harrow said softly, and the sheriff did not say, "I'm here," because presence is not told, it is shown. The latch lifted. Arya stood. The coil on the desk wasn't the one that had held her, but it would do for a lesson. She carried it to the back room and set it on the windowsill. The window rose another inch. She laid the rope over the crack like a waiting line. The window rose another inch. A hand slid in, scar across knuckles pale as a lie. Ephraim Lyle's. Breath fogged the glass. He reached for the rope, maybe to take it, maybe just to touch the thing that had betrayed him. His fingers brushed hemp. The coil leapt, not living, but willing. It tangled him to the window hinge with the swiftness of a fisherman's trick Mrs. Harrow had taught to one of her boys, the summer he wouldn't sit still. Ephraim yelped, high, soft, like a dog learning about porcupines. Walt took 2 steps and caught him by the wrist. Deputy Reeves lifted the hasp and let the window rise on its prisoner until Ephraim stood on tiptoe, his balance tied to the same instrument he had once offered to the town as order. "Good evening," Walt said politely. "Come in or go home, but do not come halfway again." He loosened the rope, drew Ephraim in, and set him on a chair where men learn what their backs are for. "You can tell me about the ledger now." Ephraim swallowed. The sound was a clock. "Silas," he began. "Your name is Ephraim," Mrs. Harrow corrected. "Use it." He did. The words poured out the way water pours when you finally admit the pipe is broken. He named men Harlan had promised protection to. He named women the Ridge had taken favors from. He named the preacher whose nephew sold lengths of hemp at discount from the rail shipment and brought back candy for children to hide the smell. He named Silas as the man who named. He did it in shivers, but he did it. Walt wrote it down. The nib scratched like a shovel. When Ephraim finished, the sheriff blew on the ink. "Tomorrow," he said mildly, "you will say it again, in sunlight." Ephraim shook his head like a rabbit trapped in a fence. "They'll gut me," he whispered. "No," Mrs. Harrow said. "They'll have to go through us first, and I set tables for funerals with a mean hand. You won't like yours." Ephraim stared at her, blinked, and for the first time in his life considered the power of a woman who chooses verbs. They bound him, not cruelly, just enough to teach his hands a new habit, and set him on a cot in the cell with a blanket and the knowledge that, for one night, panic would not be productive. He slept like a man who had finally told his name to himself. It is a hard sleep. It is the right one. Dawn scraped along the horizon in a line of copper. The town stretched, yawned, and tried to pretend it had not spent the night eavesdropping. Walt rang the bell. The bell sounded like a church that had agreed to host a trial without taking sides. Men came with hats low. Women came with chins higher. Children came with pockets full of stones, because children understand allegory better than catechism. The board took their seats. Collins with his black book, Dr. Prim with his notes, Alma Harrow with her hands folded, on a wooden spoon, because the spoon had settled more arguments than the gavel. 3 ranchers, 1 teacher, Old Man Rojas, who had seen rope used honestly to pull calves and dishonestly to pull truth into pits, and a washerwoman named Marta, who had wrung more dirty water out of the Ridge's shirts than they would admit. Silas arrived spotless, the ring on his thumb, the notch polished as if it could be erased with friction. Harlan arrived at the back with 2 men and a smile he had stolen from a picture card. Ephraim arrived between Walt and Reeves, pale and upright like a fence that had decided to try being a tree. Walt opened. He did not invoke law first. He invoked breath. "We will hear," he said. "We will not shout. We will remember names and forget nothing else." Arya stood when he called her. The room leaned toward her, some with hunger, some with hospitality, some with the need to be told they were not complicit. She gave them what she had: the wind in the junipers, the lantern's eye, the rope's song, the chair's fall, the boots, the ring, the nick, the apology offered to Glass instead of to her. She did not cry. Tears would have turned her into the right kind of victim for men who like to hold handkerchiefs like flags. She spoke like a mountain. When she finished, children in the back stood up because they needed to see over shoulders. A boy with a blue marble clutched it hard and let it cut his palm good. Silas rose for his turn. He tried to turn it into a sermon. He said community, so often the word blanched. He said the word order like a man carrying a badge he forged himself. He said men and women as if they were different species of livestock. He said nothing about rope, except that rope is a tool, and tools are innocent, and men who see guilt in tools are superstitious. He did not say the word girl. He never would. Walt turned to Ephraim. "Your ledger." Ephraim's hands shook, but his voice did not, because voices learn to walk while hands are still figuring it out. He named the dates. He named the drivers. He named the nights the Ridge used the spur to launder choice into power. He named the midnight when Harlan stood at Archer's cabin and said, "Message," and pulled a chair because he wanted to see. A woman hang still. When he said, "I cut the knot," he cried, not to be forgiven, but because the muscle that ties lying to living finally tore and relieved the pressure. Silas smiled sadly at the room. "A weak man breaks," he said. "You should not make your city out of broken men." Mrs. Harrow rose then, without being asked, and the room made space for her body the way rooms do for water-finding level. "We are all made from broken things," she said. "God calls it mending, the Ridge calls it trash. Choose your word." The ranchers nodded sharp. The teacher wrote it down. Marta the washerwoman folded her hands tighter around the spoon and looked at Silas like she would scrub him if he stood still long enough. Walt called Harlan. Harlan sauntered to the front and refused the chair. He chewed nothing and made it. Looked like courage. He said he had never seen Arya before yesterday. He said the Ridge had never ordered rope for any purpose other than hauling, branding, bundling, and righteousness. He said the nick on Silas's ring could have come from anything, and the scar on his own hand came from a quarrel with a mule. He said mule so the crowd could laugh and be his friends. They didn't. "Show us your boots," Dr. Prim requested mildly. Harlan cocked a brow. "You planning to dance with me, Doc?" "I intend to read," Dr. Prim said. Walt nodded. "Boots." Harlan flicked a hand. One of his men knelt and unhitched the spurs, Spanish rowels that glittered like many little knives. Harlan put his boots on the table, as if he were offering communion, and winked at a girl who would never take bread from him. Dr. Prim bent. He measured with a carpenter's compass he'd borrowed from Callum. He squinted. He stood and looked. At the prince Walt had lifted from Archer's cabin, with flower and patience in the grey dawn. He bent again. The room held its breath. "They don't match," he said finally. "Harlan didn't stand on that chair." He paused. "This time." Harlan smiled. He opened his mouth to pour victory into the room. "And yet," Dr. Prim added, "the print's width matches Ephraim's boot, the pair you are wearing now." He nodded to Ephraim. "Stand." Ephraim stood. He looked at his shoes as if he Had never met them. He set them on the table in silence. Dr. Prim measured. Collins read. Walt watched the room, not the boots. They fit, Dr. Prim said. Ephraim did not deny it. I pushed the chair, he said, his voice shredding but true. Silas said, show them, and Harlan laughed, and I... He swallowed. I did what I was told so I could keep standing indoors when it rained. Silas spread his hands. What did I tell you? He asked the room. Broken men. You broke them, Arya said. Silas's eyes slid to her and away as if he'd been nicked and didn't want to look at the blood. Or they were born for breaking, he murmured. Walt lifted his hand, and the last noise in the room sat down. We've heard, he said. We will retire to Way. They did not retire to Way. They did something towns do when they are brave. They weighed in front of each other. The board spoke in turn. Rojas talked about calves and knots and how hands know the truth before mouths do. The teacher talked about what children learn when men bring rope to the square. Marta talked about stains that never come out no matter how you boil cloth. Collins talked about midnight inventories and the sin of revising them in the morning. Mrs. Harrow did not talk. She looked at Silas until he shifted. Silas Valk, Walt said at last. You will surrender your ring. You will surrender Ephraim's. Ledgers, you will surrender your right to operate the spur until my office uses your books to find out whether your prosperity is theft. You will not leave San Roque. He turned. Harlan Pike, you will ride out. If you cross my line again with rope in your cart, I will shoot the rope first, and then I will see what's left of you that can answer a question. Silas reached for the chain. He paused. The smile returned with a different suit on. No, he said. The word changed the temperature of the room. Walt's hand did not move. You refuse? I do, Silas said pleasantly. Because I do not recognize your court. You're standing in it, Mrs. Harrow answered. Silas stepped back. 1 step, 2. Harlan straightened. Men by the door shifted. 1 man outside dug a piece of canvas down to reveal 3 rifles leaning where brooms should have been. Sheriff, Silas said, voice velvet, words knives. You enjoy light. I prefer shade. Come get me. He turned and walked out. Walt did not reach for his gun. He reached for his hat and put it on as a man puts on winter. San Roque, he said. We walk. They did. The crowd moved like weather. They spilled into the street behind Walt, not running, not roaring, moving, decided. Harlan stepped aside to let them pass, or to measure their backs. He did not grin now. The boy with the marble stuffed it into his pocket for courage and grabbed. His mother's hand with the other. Callum walked at Arya's shoulder. She held her head up not for the crowd, but because breath works better that way. The coil of rope she carried was the decoy, the practice coil, but it had learned a new job. Standard, banner, warning. They reached the spur. Silas stood on the platform, flanked by 2 men who thought their height could lend him authority. He looked at the approaching town and saw at last something he did not account for in his ledgers, a plurality that had decided on a verb. Stop, he said mildly. They didn't. He lifted his hand and the 2 men beside him lifted rifles. Walt didn't say don't. He said count. They hesitated. You can shoot a man who tells you to halt. It is harder to shoot a man who tells you to count, because the word asks your mouth to be human first. 10, Walt said. 9, Silas didn't lower his hand. He smiled, that white, polished smile that made juries want to be forgiven. He held the ring against his thumb like a sacrament and squeezed. 8, Walt said. Arya stepped forward out of the crowd and onto the very first step of the platform, the coil of rope in her hands. She held it up so the notch in the ring could see the nick in the lantern it had made. How many times did you miss when you practiced? She asked him. Silas blinked. It was no more than a blink. It was enough for the rifles to waver a fraction of a breath. 7, Walt said. Silas's smile flickered and then returned, harder. "You think to shame me?" he asked without moving his lips. "I do not shame." "Good," Arya said. "Then you won't mind if we open your warehouse?" She nodded at the door. 6, Walt counted. Silas lifted his chin. "You have no warrant." Dr. Prim held up a paper that wasn't a warrant and carried more weight. The list of names from Collins's book, the testimony of 37 women, the measured match of boots to dirt. "We have something better," he said. "We have us." 5, Walt said, calm as rain. Silas moved his ring and the rifles rose. 4, Walt said. Harlan Pike stepped out of the crowd to Silas's right. He wasn't smiling, he was studying the town like a man studies livestock he might buy at a bargain. "You sure?" he asked Silas softly. Silas didn't take his eyes off Walt. "Entirely." 3, Walt said. Callum touched Arya's elbow. The gesture said, "If they shoot, drop." The gesture said, "I will be between." The gesture said, "I am one man and not a wall, and I will be both anyway." 2, Walt said. Arya lifted the rope higher. The nick in the ring flashed. The nick in the lantern hood back at Archer's cabin would be flashing now too, if lanterns could attend trials. "On 1, Silas told his men. 1, Walt said. The rifles spat. Arya dropped. Silas's men had aimed high to clear her. Men who think of themselves as clean shooters always aim high, and their bullets shattered the sign above the warehouse door. The wood rained splinters. A plank fell. Behind it, darkness, movement, the shape of men, the smell of hemp, the promise of crates. Walt did not draw. He stepped. His hand hit the jamb. He yanked. The warehouse door that had been nailed by custom, not by carpentry, came open with a ripping sound that made men's mouths forget to be brave. Inside, the room bloomed with the light of a dozen windows that had always been there and somehow never seen. Coils of rope hung like false halos. Crates stood stacked and neat and guilty. A ledger opened itself on a table to the page where men had written so beautifully you could not see the theft for the penmanship. The town breathed as one thing. Silas Valk closed his eyes. Harlan Pike, who had survived long by knowing when a storm was actually a flood, took one step backward and then another, his boots finding the edge of the platform by memory. "Silas Valk," Walt said, "you are arrested for conspiracy to commit assault, for obstruction, for theft of public trust, and for weaponizing rope." He didn't look at Harlan when he added, "Harlan Pike ride." Silas opened his eyes. "No," he said for the second time. He reached for the chain at his neck, ripped it, and flung the ring into the crowd. It flew like a tiny wheel. Boys jumped. Men lunged. Marta the washerwoman caught it in her apron without moving her feet. Silas jumped. He didn't jump toward the street or toward the crowd or toward the open door of law. He jumped sideways, into the mouth of the warehouse, into the clatter of crates, into the dark he had always claimed as his true jurisdiction. Walt followed. Callum followed Walt. Arya, throat burning, breath steady, rope in her hands like a flag, that had learned its new country, followed Callum. They plunged into the dim as the town roared behind them, not a cheer, not a riot, a realization, and the warehouse swallowed them like a canyon swallow sound. Inside, the floor fell away. Silas ran along a catwalk built by men who trusted their ankles more than the law. The planks rattled, the catwalk bent toward the back, where the rail spur kissed the warehouse like a lover. He knew every beam. He had hidden coin in one of them. He had hidden worse. Walt's boots rang on the boards behind him. Callum's weight thudded a steady drum. Arya's breath counted ladders and corners, and remembered that fear is a liar when you are already doing the thing it tells you not to do. Silas turned left. The catwalk narrowed. He turned again into a run of shadow and rafters and the smell of rope oil. He flung a crate down into the path to block Walt and kept going. The crate burst and spilled coils that slithered like struck snakes. Walt stumbled, Callum leaped. Arya slid under the rail and came up with splinters in her palm and the taste of dust on her teeth. "Stop!" Walt called, not because he expected obedience, but because the word belongs to law. Silas laughed once and didn't again. He hit the far wall, grabbed a stowed hook, swung out over the spur, and landed on the roof of a boxcar from which his money had once walked in coin sacks, while his men looked like godly ushers. Callum swore. Walt considered swearing, and then didn't because his mother had taught him words should be saved for when they needed to be spent. He went for the ladder bolted to the wall. Callum went for the chain that worked the sliding door. Arya went for the lever that released the spur brake. "Don't," Walt started, and Arya realized in the same instant why he said it. The brake screamed and the car lurched and Silas stumbled and grabbed for balance and found only moving sky. He pinwheeled. The ring was gone. The boards pitched. He caught a roof seam with the last of his bad luck and hung for a heartbeat. A long, measured human heartbeat that could have been mercy if anyone here believed in it from this man. He let go. He didn't fall far. He crashed through a lower mezzanine stacked with crates that had opinions about gravity. The crates smashed and released a tangle of ropes and a spill of pinned ledger pages that whirled like unseasonal snow. Silas disappeared in the storm he had made. Walt reached the edge and looked down. Callum reached his shoulder, steadying, and looked with him. Arya reached and looked because her whole life refused to look away now. Silas Valk lay half-buried, in rope, breathing shallow, eyes open and full of too much light. "Sheriff," he said clearly, and smiled a clean, terrible smile as blood threaded from his hairline into one eye. "If you come down here, we all hang." A match flared in the dark beside him. Rope drank flame the way a dry century drinks rain. Arya felt heat lift and take her lungs. She saw the fire catch and walk along hemp like a thief invited home. She saw the ledger pages curl and ignite and carry accusations upward on hot breath. She saw the line of the catwalk quiver in heat that would cut feet, and the door they had, left open, go black with smoke. Walt turned, calculating exits, calculating lives, calculating sin and what to do with it when it was on fire. Callum grabbed Arya's wrist, the warehouse roared, and then the roof groaned. A beam, one of the old ones, pine heartwood black with oil and years, shuddered, popped, and dropped sideways into the path of collapse, half bridging the chasm between catwalk and crate C. "Go," Walt shouted, voice already hoarse with smoke. "Get out." Callum shook his head. "You first." "Out!" Walt ordered, and his eyes moved to Arya. "That's a law, too." She looked down at Silas and the fire he had chosen, and the rope that had chosen him back. She looked at the beam cutting a rough path through heat and falling things. She looked at the door and the light beyond it that contained the town and the bell and a boy with a blue marble who would later swear he saw justice with it. She set the coil down. She stepped onto the beam, smoke bit, heat pushed. Somewhere below, a crate burst with a sound like a shot and belched ledgers into upward spirals. Silas coughed and laughed and coughed again. "Arya!" Callum called, a raw scrape of fear and respect. She didn't look back. She moved one foot to the narrow, hot plank. She followed the math of rafter and gravity and breath. She took the next step, then another. Halfway across, the beam spat sparks and dipped. She put her arms out to balance and felt the heat lick the linen at her throat, tasted juniper in the smoke like a ghost of Ephraim's chew. She saw the line she needed to reach, a stack of crates unburning yet, a small island. She stepped. The beam groaned and slid. She fell forward into smoke and emptiness and flame. A hand caught her, strong, scarless, furious at fate. The hand hauled her up by the wrist until her ribs found board again, and the rest of her found the rough grit of wood and the mercy of purchase. Callum's face loomed through smoke, a cut on his cheek reopened and running, his eyes as calm as rain. He had followed her onto the beam because there are men who do not understand the word out when it comes after a name they've chosen to keep safe. "We go together," he said. Behind them, the catwalk buckled. Ahead, the ledger storm turned into sparks. Below, Silas Valk lay in his own tinder and smiled up at the people he had meant to bury. And somewhere in that boiling dark, a fuse line of flame hissed toward a powder keg someone had forgotten to lie about. The warehouse floor shook. Sound gathered at the far end, deep, round, freighted, like a train that has decided to come through a wall instead of a door. Arya looked at Callum. Callum looked at Walt. Walt looked at the door. The beam lifted under them as heat made wood do impossible math. They had 3 heartbeats to decide. Then the world leapt. They were coming, not shadows now, but men shaped out of flame and will. Torches shouldered like verdicts, horses snorting smoke. The ridge moved as if somebody had taught them a hymn, and they had learned only the chorus. Fire washed their faces, the same color, and made their eyes bright with a single idea. Walt Harrow stepped into the street and let the torchlight paint the badge on his chest, a melted star. Delia Stokes did not ask permission. She took her place on his left, long duster, open, carbine slung, jaw a straight line that had argued with worse math than this, and survived. Judge Otero stood behind them with his pen in his hand, because some men fight with ink, even when the air tastes of creosote. Arya moved until her shoulder brushed the sheriff's sleeve. Callum came to her right, 1 pace forward, as if he were. A new post set in concrete. Ezra Quintero shifted, so his peg found the rhythm of the ground, and his one good boot planted as if it had grown there. Alma Harrow stepped up with the wooden spoon that had become myth by use. Behind them, San Roque stacked itself into the shape of a town that has made up its mind. Harlan Pike rode at the ridge's point with his hands still chained at the wrist from the afternoon's fight. Chain now looped through his belt like a decorative sin. A temple of flames swam in each of his pupils. He looked every inch the story he'd rehearsed since boyhood, the dangerous man arriving to finish a sentence. Silas Valk rode 3 horses back, hatless, arm-bound, smile reassembled with effort. The ring was gone, but habit sat on his face, like an old friend. Around and behind the front rank, men with rifles lifted them and felt important. Some had the look of believers. Most had the look of buyers. Delia's voice was low enough that only the street heard it. "Sheriff," she said, "I'll take warrant on their leaders. You take the line. No crossfire if we can help it. Keep your people low. And if anybody aims at a woman or a child, I will turn this torch parade into a graveyard." Walt nodded once. He didn't look at her when he answered, because the sightline to Harlan mattered more than agreement. "Fair," he said. "No speeches unless they don't listen." "They won't listen," Ezra murmured, "but say it anyway. It matters later when they write themselves new memories." Walt took a step. "Men of the Ridge," he called. Voice steady, on the breath of a preacher who'd learned to be law. "Put your torches down. If you've come to give testimony, we'll hear it in the morning when the sun is awake. If you've come to set fire to anything but your own pride, go home, because we are not burning tonight." Harlan laughed. He raised his chained hands as if he were about to bless the town with flame. "Sheriff," he sang, "the Ridge has come to collect its due." He jerked his chin at Silas. "You have what belongs to us." "Not anymore," Delia said, tone flat. She stepped forward and let the badge on her hip breathe torchlight. "Silas Valk, you are in federal custody for conspiracy, the transportation of contraband through interstate commerce, the coercion of citizens under color of false authority, and attempted murder. Harlan Pike, you are wanted on federal warrant for accessory to the same and for the obstruction of a federal officer." Silas smiled at her like a man who loves a new word so he can misuse it. "Officer," he repeated. You are very far from a federal courthouse, Marshal. Delia didn't blink. Courts don't make the law, they keep it. Men and women walking upright make it every day. She nodded at the torchbearers. Last warning, ground those brands. Something moved at the edge of the ridge column. Uriah saw it, the smallest flinch of a man's wrist, the minute tilt of a torch toward dry wood. She stepped a half-pace forward because her body remembered the rope and refused to let fire learn that lesson too. "Don't," Callum said softly, but he was already beside her. From the alley, a boy's voice rose small and clear as a creek. "Don't burn my town." Jory stood there, with his blue marble clenched in his fist so tight it cut a crescent in his palm. He glared like a candle refusing to go out. Harlan saw the boy and smiled with something like genuine fondness twisted into cruelty. He lifted his torch, let wax drip. "Torch," he said, "is nothing but daylight that learned teeth. Let it teach." Delia raised her carbine. "1 more inch," she said, "and I chew back." The ridgeline shivered. For an instant, the town and the men with fire balanced on the point of a pin the size of a choice. Then the man with the clever hands, Ephraim Lyle, who had told truth and learned that telling is a skill you have to keep, stepped out of Walt's cell door with rope burns on his wrists and a clean shirt Alma had shoved at him, and he faced the torches and lifted his chin. "Put them down," he said to the men who had once been his men, "or you take me with them." "Ephraim," Harlan said, making the name into a riddle. "I told the truth," Ephraim replied. "It made me taller." "Hang him!" a voice in the ridge crowd called. "Try," Walt said, and somehow made the word gentler than a dare. The front rank hesitated. The second rank lifted the torches higher, because when men don't know what to do, they think elevation helps. The third rank shuffled like feet in church. Harlan's eyes flickered over the faces and found too many cracks. "Silas," he said without looking back, "say something." Silas did not speak to the crowd. He spoke to Arya because his eyes had finally learned where the hinge was. "You think this is a story about rope and rings," he said. "It is a story about hunger. Rope is how you flavor it." Arya's throat ached, but not with old bruise. "Then we will learn to cook differently," she said. Silas laughed, a sound like paper cutting a finger. "You will starve." "No," Alma Harrow said, calm as bread. "We will share." She stepped to the edge of the torchlight, lifted her spoon, and pointed at the faces she knew well enough to love despite themselves. "Ephraim's boys ate at my table when rope kept their fathers too busy to remember supper. 1 more mouth never broke us." Walt's voice snapped back into the moment like a bolt sliding home. "Torches," he commanded. "Down," for a breath that stretched like a rope. It looked as if flame would argue. Then 1 torch dipped, another. The fire leaned toward dirt and set it smoking. Smoke, unlike flame, listens. "Guns," Harlan said conversationally, seeing his first plan soften. "Guns will do." He dropped his torch and drew the small pistol he must have kept in a boot, a habit his boot and his ankle hated. Delia's carbine spoke before his pistol did. The bullet found the chain between his wrists and snapped it with a sound, like the last link in a lie breaking. Startled, Harlan fired wild and hit a sign that read, "Dry Goods." The D fell. "Go S" hung there like a grim joke. "Enough," Judge Otero said. A tired man's prayer and a law in 1 word. The square exploded, not with bullets, not at first, with motion. Ridgemen surged. San Roque stepped forward to meet them. Delia moved like a hinge, pivoting to cover the angles Walt couldn't see. Ezra took 3 steps and put his peg down so hard the boards remembered him. Callum flowed around Arya so her forward edge could stay forward without being foolish. Jory ducked under Alma's arm and fetched stones from the barrel of water to put into hands that had never needed them until now. Silas slid out of his saddle like oil and moved toward the dark behind the livery. Walt saw and sent Reeves and Jonas after him with a nod that said, "Bring him back whole, because justice breaks men better than fists do." Harlan came straight for Arya. Because men like him always go for the center of the thing that scares them. His pistol barked once, twice. Arya felt air twitch near her ear. Then she was inside his reach, close enough to see the flecks of ash caught in his lashes. Close enough to smell old whiskey and newer lies. He raised the pistol for a third shot, and her hand came down on his wrist with the precision of a woman who has learned where to put force. "Callum," she said, but the call was a thread, not a plea. He was there already, catching Harlan's elbow and turning it so that the pain wrote a sentence into his shoulder he'd read later when it rained. Harlan dropped the pistol and went for the chain. As if he could turn his broken bond into a weapon again, he swung. The chain kissed Callum's cheek, opening the cut that had already learned to bleed for this town. Callum grunted and stayed. Arya stepped in and did a thing her aunt had showed her when she was 11 and mean to live. Heel down on instep, palm to jaw, knee to thigh. Harlan's legs forgot their job, and he went to one knee hard enough to jar his teeth. "Yield," Callum said again, and perhaps he hated the word, but he had decided to offer it like bread. Harlan spat. "You first." He swung his fist. Learned. Nothing. Missed. Delia's shadow fell across them. She didn't shoot. She brought the carbine down like a judge's gavel on the crown of his head with a mercy that cracked only the world he had built inside himself. Harlan sagged against Arya's skirt. She stepped aside and let him hit dirt. Across the street, two ridgemen tried to set the church steps alight out of spite. Marta appeared from nowhere and doused the flame with a bucket of mop water, and the phrase "not today" in a tone that had raised children through cholera and worse. The men looked at her as if she were a law of physics. Perhaps she was. They ran. Silas did not run far. Jonas and Reeves found him in the alley with a hand on the lock of the freight gate and no plan for after. Jonas grabbed his wrist, and Reeves took his collar, and they walked him back into the square like a pair of ushers who had finally found their deacon in the wrong pew. He kept his smile and his posture. Both looked tired. The torches lay smoking. The guns had learned something. The square breathed. Arya stood with her fists open and her shoulders set and felt, for the first time since the cabin, a place inside her chest unclench and stay. Delia looked around and nodded once. "This is over," she said. "No," Silas replied, mild as weather. "This chapter is over. The book is long." Otero moved forward, spine straight, pen ready. "Then we will bind it," he said, and reached for the paper Alma had kept dry in her apron pocket, the injunction written in a hand that would not be taken back by rain. "Silas Valk," he said, bureaucratic and holy, "you are remanded to federal custody. Harlan Pike, likewise. The court will hear anything you have to say that is true. It will dismiss the rest." Silas's eyes found Arya again. "You have made enemies," he told her softly. "Men more patient than Harlan. Men who do not wear rings where you can see them. I have made friends," she returned. "Women more patient than you can imagine. Women who need no rings." He inclined his head once, almost courtly, the last curtsy of a man who understood, too late, that the room had shifted around him. They took him. They took Harlan. The ridge men who had ridden in to see a burning and stayed to watch a town stand. Left in silence, their torches dead, their horses treading the ash of pride. The night exhaled. "Eat," Alma said then, "because a town isn't done until someone says it can stop." The street turned into a kitchen, because kitchens are where victories are banked. Marta put coffee into hands that shook. Collins set a ledger under the legs of a table that wobbled, because some books are best put under furniture. Dr. Prim cleaned Callum's cheek with a tenderness he reserved for men who had finally learned to keep their faces turned toward good trouble. Delia sat on the step and cleaned her carbine with a rag that had once been a hymn. "Tomorrow," she said, not looking up, "I take them to the junction and then on to Santa Fe. There will be a grand jury if I have to build the room myself." She glanced at Arya. "Come with us, give testimony, or stay." Plant. Arya looked at the rope on the table, the dead snake. She looked at Ezra's peg, at Jonas's hands, at Callum rubbing a thumb across the blue marble to clean the river mud out of its seam. She looked at the deed under her bodice, at the cabin hill in the map behind her eyes. She looked at the horizon the marshal had brought into the square like a second dawn. "I stay," she said, "and I will come later, if the story needs a voice that was there when the rope sang." Delia nodded. "It will," she said. "It always does." She slid the carbine back into its scabbard and stood. "Before I ride, I want to see the place you started this from." "The cabin," Arya said quietly. "Tonight?" Callum asked. Delia's mouth tugged. "I don't like to sleep near men who wear rings on chains," she said. "A roof that remembers truth might lend me better dreams." They walked, not alone. Ezra came, and Jonas and Alma with a lantern, because women who run towns don't forget the trivial holiness of light. Walt came as far as the edge of the square and stopped. The sheriff never leaves the center if the center might be asked for in the night. Judge Otero tipped his hat from the office chair like a man who has waited all his life to sign a day like this and will set his pen in the morning. The path to the cabin learned their feet quickly. The junipers held night in their spines, and let it go. The door stood the way doors stand when they have been shown a map to honest hands. Inside, the air remembered chalk and choice, and the sound a woman makes when she decides to live. Delia stood in the doorway and took off her hat, and did not step forward until the room gave her leave. She looked at the beam, the lantern hood, the shelf where an empty clay jar sat with a crack like a smile. She looked at the scratch in the floor where a chair had moved from under a body and then back under everything that mattered. She did not say, "I am sorry," she said, "I see." Arya set the lantern down. Its flame made a soft sound like a throat clearing to speak. "This is where I met who I am," she said. "And who is that?" Delia asked. "Not a test. A mapmaker's. Who question. Someone who won't be hung for somebody else's sermon," Arya said. "Someone whose name is older than their rope." Delia gave the smallest smile Arya had seen on her face yet. "Good," she said. She turned to Callum. "And you?" "Someone who builds," he said simply, touching the doorframe with the affection of a man who has loved wood longer than he has loved himself, and breaks what needs breaking. Delia nodded. "I'll take them," she said, meaning Silas and Harlan, meaning the rot that had sprouted rings. "You take this." She gestured at the cabin, at the town invisible through the walls, at the fields that would require hours, and then days of hands. "Make it proof." "We will," Arya said. They slept in the cabin on blankets that smelled of smoke and flour. The room listened and learned their breaths and held them. Ezra sat on the step and watched the dark breathe. Jonas snored. Callum lay awake until the little noises of a house becoming a home sounded familiar, and then he let his eyes close. Arya dreamed, not of rope, but of water, and of a field furrowed straight by a line chalked with her grandmother's name. Morning came with the insolent cheerfulness only mornings manage. They rode to the junction and watched Delia load her prisoners into the railcar the federal government maintained for just this kind of story. She shook Walt's hand like a colleague and tipped her hat 2 degrees at Alma. She took Arya's fingers for a breath and squeezed once, a soldier's goodbye. "Right," she said, "or plant. Either way, don't stop." "We won't," Arya answered. The train took Silas and Harlan into a horizon they deserved. The town exhaled and then inhaled differently. They began the work that comes after victory. It is slower. It is the real part. They mended the warehouse roof, 1 shingle at a time. They turned the spur into a walkway for feet that needed to learn to go somewhere other than a ledger. They made the citizens' board into something that met on Tuesdays and listened even when nobody bled in the street. They planted beans on Ezra's deed and squash and a row of corn that would test the soil's memory. They hung a bell in the square and ringed it only for births and fires and the reading of names. They made a rule, argued it into a better one, and then codified it in 3 lines nobody could misunderstand. They laughed, they fought, they wrote receipts for kindness. Arya built fences with Jonas and Ezra and Callum until the line of posts looked like a spine laid down by a creature that meant to stand. She burned the last of the old rope in a fire behind the church, and the smoke rose straight and then was gone. She went to the cabin and found a blue marble tucked behind a jar and set it in the window where it made a circle of sky on the floor at noon. Jory came every day to see it and reported faithfully on what the marble had learned. "It says the sky is bigger than we are," he told her solemnly, "but not by as much as it used to be." "Good," Arya said. "Keep teaching it." She gave him a cup of milk and a heel of bread and sent him to school, because arithmetic is a weapon in the right mouth. In the evenings, when the heat bled off the ground and the light went generous, she and Callum sat on the cabin step and let their shoulders lean so lightly a sparrow could have flown between them without noticing. They talked when talking was better than not. They were quiet when quiet did more. "Your hands," she said one night, taking them and turning them over. The scars had learned to look like maps instead of warnings. "Do they still pray?" "They do," he said. "They ask to be useful." "They are," she answered and kissed his knuckles like a signature. He breathed. "There is one more thing," he said carefully, as men do when the thing could change the shape of a day. "I want to buy the cabin from the paper that says it's mine for $7 again. Only this time I want to write your name on it with mine." She looked at him as if he had said sunrise and meant it. "We will write my grandmother's," she said after a little, "and then mine under it, and then, if you like, yours beside." He grinned the grin he tried not to use because it gave him away as someone who had not quite relinquished joy. "Beside," he said. They took the paper to Judge Otero, who drew new lines with a hand that no longer shook. They posted it on the cabin wall under the lantern hood, where men could read it and dust could learn it by heart. It said, in the simple grammar the town loved now, "This place belongs to names that do not come off under rain." Summer ripened. The beans climbed. The corn remembered. The squash sprawled like a lazy prophet predicting bread. The warehouse went quiet and then useful, storing things that fed mouths instead of habits. The ring in Marta's apron lived in a drawer behind her stove, until the day she took it out and threw it into the forge at the smithy and watched it soften. The smith hammered it into a simple hook for a barn, and nobody mentioned what it used to be. Letters came. One from Delia on federal stationery that smelled faintly of train. The grand jury had indicted Silas Valk on a list of charges that made Alma whistle low. Harlan had been transferred to a territorial prison whose name sounded like a warning. Delia's hand, tight and plain, wrote, "They will not be the last. The work is wide. It helps to know you're doing your end." Another letter came addressed to Ezra, care of Arya, hand shaky but stubborn. It was from a woman in a little town 3 days north who wrote that she had a memory of a man who had borrowed her name and some of her time and owed both back with interest. Ezra read it and went very quiet for 3 days, and then packed a bag that could carry 2 kinds of truth. He came back 2 weeks later with a boy and a girl who both had his eyes and neither had his last name, and everyone simply widened the table. The fall brought a harvest and a handful of men from other towns who wanted to learn how San Roque had walked out of the alley with rope still coiled on the table instead of around their throats. Uriah told it plain. Walt told it shorter. Alma told it with recipes. Collins wrote it into a pamphlet and handed it out until the edges got fingerprints. One evening, as the sky practiced the color it uses right before winter, Ezra came up the path with a piece of paper folded like a problem he had solved. He handed it to Arya without meeting her eyes. The paper was an invoice from the rail company. It showed a shipment billed to the Arrowhorn Credit Association and paid by a man whose name looked imported, Losada. The cargo listed rope, lantern oil, rail spikes, teachers' slates. The line under it read, "Special Arrangement. Phoenix." "Phoenix?" Arya asked, heart stepping oddly. Ezra nodded. "I asked Delia," he said. "She wrote back that the Ridge was a franchise." He said the new word carefully, as if it had teeth. "There are men in other counties who like the shape of this story. They copy it. They change the names. They keep the rings." Callum leaned against the doorframe. "Then our fence," he said, "goes further." Walt arrived a minute later, as if news and him shared a horse. He took the invoice and the breath after, and his eyes went to Arya like a compass to north. "You'll be asked," he said, "to ride, to stand up in rooms where nobody knows us and say the first lines again." Arya looked at the field, at the cabin, at the town. She felt the pull of the road in her bones, the way some people hear weather before it comes. She also felt the weight of the deed under her skin like a quiet hand. She turned the word Phoenix over in her mouth and decided. It tasted like smoke and possibility. "I will go," she said, "when the beans are in, when the children can do their sums with the blue marble and without it. When Alma says she has enough spoons to distribute." Alma laughed. "I always have enough spoons," she said. "I count them like other women count jewels." Ezra touched Arya's shoulder. "I'll walk the fence while you ride," he said. "And I'll teach Jonas to set posts straight without cussing." "Impossible!" Jonas called from the yard and cussed for punctuation, and then apologized to Alma out of reflex. They held a meeting in the square, under the cottonwood, under the bell. Delia was not here to give them authority. They had learned, finally, to grant it to themselves when needed. Walt spoke first and said the short version. Collins read the invoice and the long version. Judge Otero said he could write writs that would travel as far as paper could carry them, and further in a pocket. Alma said nothing and stirred a pot big enough to feed strangers. Dr. Prim said he had tonics for travel and bandages for consequences. Marta said the ring was now a barn. Hook and it held a bucket, and that felt right. Iria stood, and the square made the space her voice liked. "We cut one root," she said. "There are others. Men will try to grow the same tree again in different dirt. We will go and show them why it won't take." She nodded at Callum. "Some of us will build fences there until the posts know their names. Some will stay here and keep what we've made from being stolen while we're generous. Some will write, some will send bread." She lifted her chin. "All of us will remember where the rope is. It is always near the shelf where a lantern sits. It is always near a chair. It is always near the place women keep their names. We will guard those places like wells." The vote was not a vote so much as a breath. They breathed yes. The day before Arya and Callum rode east, they went to the cabin alone. The field lay stubbed and honest. The lantern hood bore a new nick where Ezra had bumped it with his hat and said a word Alma had agreed to pretend she hadn't heard. The shelf held a row of jars with beans in them that looked like small, filed promises. Callum laid 2 papers on the table. One was the deed. The other was something he had written out in his own scrawl, a list of rules that weren't really rules but habits. "Read them," he said, half shy. She read, "We put the lamp out with breath, not with hands that shake. We do not keep rope in this room. We say the names of the women who built the fence before we sleep. We sharpen the knife that saved us and use it for bread when we can. We let boys keep marbles on the sill, so the sun can learn circles. We do not write our history for men who like to edit. We plant." She folded the paper and tucked it under the deed. "Add 1, she said. 8, he asked. 8, she said. "We come back," he smiled. "We will." They rode at sunrise. Ezra and Jonas walked them to the edge of the wash. Alma hugged Arya hard enough to put courage into her ribs. Walt shook Callum's hand and then, unexpectedly, hugged him too, because some men earn it. Collins pressed a pamphlet into Arya's pocket and apologized on behalf of all pamphlets. Dr. Prim tucked a small jar of salve where Arya would find it when she needed it, which is when men are not looking. Judge Otero handed her a letter with a seal she could break when a man at a desk needed reminding that he was not the only one who could read statutes. Jory ran up with the blue marble. "Take it," he panted. "It sees for you, too." Arya knelt. "Keep it," she said. "Teach it how to look after things. I'll borrow your eyes when I need them." He nodded solemnly, because he was the town's astronomer now. They turned their horses toward the road that had learned their names, and the town watched until the dust took them. Ezra lifted a hand. Callum lifted one back. Arya did not look. Over her shoulder, because some promises are kept by facing forward. The ride to Phoenix took 5 days, and all the patience she had learned in one. They moved through towns that looked like San Roque had, before it remembered itself. Rope visible where it shouldn't be, ledgers shiny where food should have been, men in hats that meant nothing talking as if their mouths were badges. Arya and Callum stopped and listened and did not preach. They asked questions and wrote names. They showed a photograph of a ring that was now a barn hook and watched men flinch. They told a story too simple to smother. On the 3rd day, a man with a roll and a suit stopped them outside a town whose signboard had peeled in the sun. He asked their business and did not deserve an answer. Arya gave it anyway because she had decided generosity would be their first weapon. "Names," she said. "We're collecting them so we can give them back to themselves." He laughed like a drawer closing. "You think you can change how men behave?" "No," she said. "We think we can change what women allow." He stared at her and decided to stop them later. They did not stop. They arrived in Phoenix with dust in their hair, and a letter for a marshal, and a story for anyone with ears. It unfolded again, of course. It always does. Rooms where rope had learned to masquerade as discipline. Ledgers that had learned to hide, in theft in decimals. Men whose rings had been polished by wives who had forgotten their own names long enough to shine someone else's. Delia appeared from a different angle, badge catching sun, and smiled her 2-degree smile at Arya, like the right kind of conspiracy. "You came," she said. "Good." They did it again and differently. They learned new hymns for this fight and taught them back. They watched as women who had not known each other in the morning braided hair on courthouse steps by afternoon, because waiting can be a kind of marching. They watched a bell ring for the right reasons. They broke a clip off a post nobody had admitted was a gallows and let it fall into dust. They took rings and melted them and made hooks and hinges, and once, a tiny horseshoe that Jory would have loved. They came home in winter with their saddlebags full of letters, receipts, and the relief that comes when the thing you feared would bend you instead makes you stronger. San Roque was there because towns like that do not move without their people. The cabin was there. The field was stubbled and sure. The blue marble on the sill had not moved. The circle of sky it made was a little different because winter is closer. Ezra met them at the path and hugged them with arms that had learned a new strength from holding small children and fence posts. Jonas had a new scar and a new joke about it. Alma had made a stew that tasted like the opposite of rope. Walt had a ledger with names of men who had tried to test the new fence and failed. Judge Otero had ink on his fingers and no apology for it. Dr. Prim had a new list of births, written in a more careful hand than his prescriptions. Collins had another pamphlet he swore was shorter. Marta had a barn hook that did its job without telling anyone about it. They sat that night in the square and told the road what it had taught them. And when the talking was done, and the children were asleep on blankets, and the bell felt no need to ring, Arya stood and faced the people who had carried her when breathing was impossible. "This isn't done," she said. "It's never done. Men will keep trying to make rope into a language. We will keep teaching the right words. She looked down the east road where Phoenix slept, and beyond that to places whose names she didn't know yet. She looked down the west road, where the mountains kept her grandmother's name safe under snow. She looked at the north road, where danger still wore familiar boots. She looked at the south road, where new friends lived. "Tomorrow," she said, smiling because the word had become the town's promise. The square breathed it back to her and to itself. And then the telegraph in the depot chattered alive with an insistence that made Walt stand up and Judge Otero squint. The operator, a boy with swift fingers and a sense of theater, wrote the message and ran it to the circle. Walt read. His mouth tightened and then softened. He looked at Arya. "It's from Delia," he said. "Silas Valk escaped custody outside Las Cruces. Coach ambushed, 2 dead. She's on his trail. He's heading north. North, where the mountains held kin and the fence ran into rock. North, where a deed lay under snow. North, where a father had made a promise to teach a boy to set posts straight. North, where the first rope had sung and been cut, and where a man who had learned nothing might try to make it sing again." Callum stood. "We ride," he said simply. "We ride," Walt echoed. "I'll cook for the road," Alma said, and did not ask if anyone was hungry. Ezra put his palm flat on the table where the dead rope had lain and felt the small tremor of a town preparing to move without breaking. "I walk the fence while you go south and east," he said. "I will walk it while you go north." His peg tapped once, twice. A drum counting men in. Arya took the blue marble from the sill and rolled it into her palm. It showed her the circle of the lamp flame, the circle of the moon, the circle of a ring-turned hook. She closed her fist around it until it pressed a crescent into her skin. She lifted her eyes and looked at the road. "Tomorrow," she said one last time for the day. At first light, the town rose like a body stretching. The bell did not ring. It didn't need to. They knew. They went to their beds and lay down their heads and listened to the night take its breath. Somewhere a coyote laughed at nothing, the same way men do when they cannot explain why they are afraid. Somewhere the river moved along its stones and kept its secrets long enough for morning to comb them out with light. Arya slept with her boots by the door and her name in her mouth like a prayer she had learned to invent. Callum slept with a knife in reach and both hands open. Walt did not sleep much. He never did before a ride. Alma slept with 3 spoons under her pillow because she is not a fool. Ezra slept light and woke at every imagined sound and every real one and said, "No," to both until they went away. Morning will come. The North Road will wait. Men who love rings will ride into a story they did not write. A woman with a name older than rope will meet them there with a town at her back. And if you stand quiet enough at the edge of the field at first light, you can hear it. The soft sound of beans growing, of fence lines settling, of a blue marble, warming in a window, of a town making a language out of breath and names instead of rope. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.